It began with thunder, a storm not of weather, but of steel. In the frozen dawn of January 12, 1945, the eastern horizon lit up in fire. From the marshes of the Vistula River to the snows of Poland, the earth trembled as more than 40,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire in unison. For hours the bombardment rolled across the plains like the voice of the apocalypse, a ceaseless roar that shattered the frozen ground and broke the last illusions of the German Reich. Villages vanished beneath the shell fire. Trenches collapsed. Men went deaf from the noise alone. And when the guns finally fell silent, an even greater sound rose, the clatter of treads, the rumble of engines, the cry of Za Rodinu. For out of that inferno came the Red Army, 1,000,000 men surging westward like a tidal wave of vengeance. This was the Vistula Oder Offensive, the Red Storm toward Berlin, the Soviet Union's final hammer blow that crushed Germany's eastern front and opened the road to the heart of Hitler's empire. To understand the scale of what came that January, one must first look back at the year before, to the cost of victory and the hunger for retribution. The Soviet Union had endured unimaginable loss. Cities erased, 20 million dead, entire regions burned to the ground by the German invasion. Yet by the end of 1944, the tide had turned. The Red Army had retaken Belorussia, Ukraine, and much of Poland in a series of relentless offensives. Now the war had reached its final stage. The Vistula River, swollen and frozen, marked the last great natural barrier before Germany itself. Beyond it lay the Oder River, a mere 40 miles from Berlin. Between those two rivers lay the dying remains of the Wehrmacht's Army Group A, once proud, now hollow, a collection of exhausted divisions, boys and old men, barely 50 tanks, and crumbling defenses built more on hope than steel. Facing them was the most powerful army the world had ever seen. Under Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front, the Soviet Union gathered more than 2.5 million men, 5,000 tanks, and a hurricane of artillery that would outmatch anything before or since. Their mission was not merely military, it was symbolic. Every man in the Red Army knew what waited beyond the Oder, the capital of the nation that had brought their homeland to ruin. For them this was not just an offensive, it was judgment. The attack began before dawn. On January 12, in southern Poland, Konev's troops struck first near Biranów-Sandomierski. The snowstorm of shells was so intense that German commanders described it as the end of the world. Within hours, the front disintegrated. Soviet tanks, T-34, S-2C, and Su-100S, punched through the shattered lines, cutting off units before they could even report the attack. Within days, entire corps of the German 4th Panzer Army were overrun. Civilians fled west in endless columns of carts and wagons, their silhouettes black against the white horizon, their faces hollow with fear. 3 days later, Zhukov unleashed his first Belarusian front from the Magnuszew bridgehead, just south of Warsaw. The effect was immediate, overwhelming, and total. The German 9th Army, once a formidable force, was torn apart. Soviet tanks bypassed strong points, encircling them with breathtaking speed. In less than a week, the Red Army advanced nearly 100 miles, a pace unheard of on the Eastern Front. The city of Łódź fell on January 19th, followed by Poznań, whose garrison would hold out for weeks in a hopeless siege. In Warsaw, the ruins of the city, once crushed by both the Nazis and the failure of the uprising, were liberated by the Soviets, its rubble now a monument to vengeance and survival. Everywhere the German defense collapsed under the weight of the assault. Field Marshal Heinrich Himmler, hastily appointed to command the army group Vistula, could do little but issue impossible orders from his headquarters miles from the front. Hitler, still delusional in Berlin, screamed for counterattacks that never came. The once mighty Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Its soldiers, cut off and surrounded, fought in scattered pockets, often to the death, while the Red Army swept past them like fire through dry grass. For the Soviets, the advance became an unstoppable flood. Their tanks thundered westward, covering up to 30 miles a day, driving across the plains of Poland toward the Oder. Supply lines stretched thin, but momentum carried them forward. Soviet soldiers passed through villages that had been scenes of horror only years before, where mass graves lay hidden beneath the snow, where locals whispered of executions and deportations. Every step toward Germany was a step toward vengeance. Civilians fled in terror, clogging the roads with refugees as the Red Army closed in. The once invincible Reich was now a land of smoke, ruin, and retreat. By January 25th, the offensive had achieved the impossible. In just 2 weeks, the Red Army had advanced over 300 miles, destroying the German Army Group A, capturing most of Poland, and reaching the Oder River, a mere 40 miles from Berlin. Soviet bridgeheads were established at Kustrin, Steinau, and Frankfurt an der Oder. Despite fierce counterattacks, the guns of Berlin could now be heard in the distance. The Germans called it the Red Storm. For the people trapped beneath it, it was more than a storm, it was the reckoning of history. The cost, however, was unimaginable. The roads were lined with corpses, soldiers, civilians, and animals alike. Entire towns vanished beneath the advance. In their path, the Red Army left a trail of destruction that mirrored the suffering inflicted upon their own homeland. Acts of vengeance, looting, executions, and worse, became the dark shadow of victory. Yet for the men who had seen Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Smolensk burn, mercy was a memory buried long ago. This was not a campaign of conquest. It was the final stage of a war of annihilation. By February, the Vistula Oder Offensive had reached its limit. The Soviet armies halted along the Oder, exhausted and stretched thin. Their supply lines overextended. They stood staring across the frozen river at the last barrier before Berlin. Beyond the far bank lay the final prize, the city where the war had begun and where it would end. Hitler's empire now lay in pieces. The road to his bunker open. The Red Army had done in 2 weeks what had once taken the Germans 2 years. The Vistula Oder Offensive remains one of the most astonishing military operations in history, not just for its speed or scale, but for what it symbolized. It was the moment the balance of power in Europe shifted irrevocably eastward. The Soviet Union had not only avenged its past but claimed its future. The road from the Vistula to the Oder was not just the path to Berlin, it was the path to the new world that would follow. Today, the fields of Poland are quiet again. The rivers run clear, where once they were red. The forests whisper with wind instead of artillery, but beneath the soil lie the traces of that January storm, the shells, the bones, the ghosts of men who fought and died in the final surge of a war without mercy. The Vistula Oder Offensive was not a single battle. It was the collapse of an empire, the final surge of a tide that could no longer be stopped. It was the thunder before Berlin, the storm before the silence. Tonight we return to those frozen plains, to the roar of artillery that shook the dawn, to the endless columns of tanks moving west, and to the soldiers who carried the weight of vengeance on their shoulders. This is the entire history of the Vistula Oder Offensive, the Red Storm toward Berlin, the reckoning of the Eastern Front, and the fire that marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you listening beneath calm skies, far from the frozen rivers of the east, or can you almost feel the rumble of that approaching storm in the distance? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. December 28th, 1944, 1100 hours, Magnuszew Bridgehead, western bank of the Vistula River. The temperature registered -18 degrees Celsius when Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov stepped from his staff car into a forest that had ceased to exist as forest 3 weeks earlier. Every square meter of birch and pine had been transformed into camouflage. Every clearing concealed artillery batteries, arranged wheel to wheel. Every frozen track supported tanks, positioned so densely that crews could pass tools between vehicles without leaving their hatches. The bridgehead measured only 12 kilometers wide and 8 kilometers deep, yet within this compressed space, the 1st Belarusian Front had assembled the 8th Guards Army, complete with 476 tanks, the 5th Shock Army with its entire complement of artillery, and forward elements of the 2nd Guards Tank Army, waiting 3 kilometers behind the front line. Zhukov walked slowly through positions where soldiers had been ordered to maintain absolute silence for 72 hours, where camouflage discipline had become so strict that men relieved themselves into containers rather than create paths in the snow, where the metallic forest of gun tubes and tank barrels waited under netting that from 500 meters distance appeared to be nothing more than winter woodland. The bridgehead existed because Soviet operational planning had learned from 3 years of German defensive success. In August 1944, the 1st Belarusian Front had forced crossings of the Vistula at 3 locations, establishing footholds on the western bank before German reinforcements could seal the river line. The Magnuszew bridgehead anchored the southern position. The Poznań bridgehead held the center 40 kilometers north, and smaller positions at Warsaw and Rembertów provided additional crossing sites for exploitation forces. German Army Group A, commanded by Generaloberst Josef Harpe, had repeatedly attempted to eliminate these bridgeheads through November and December, committing the 4th Panzer Army's remaining mobile reserves in counterattacks that achieved local penetrations but never succeeded in reaching the river. Each German assault expended resources that could not be replaced, while Soviet forces used the winter months to reinforce the bridgeheads with troops, equipment and ammunition stockpiles sufficient for sustained offensive operations. By late December, the 3 main bridgeheads contained not the reinforced divisions German intelligence estimated, but rather 7 complete combined arms armies with their supporting artillery, tank corps and logistical infrastructure. German Army Group A's intelligence assessment, presented to Harpe's headquarters on January 8, 1945, estimated total Soviet strength along the Vistula front at approximately 1,500,000 men. The actual figure exceeded 2,200,000 soldiers. German intelligence calculated Soviet tank strength at approximately 2,000 vehicles. The actual number approached 6,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. The 4th Panzer Army's intelligence officer, drawing on reports from reconnaissance flights, prisoner interrogations, and observation posts overlooking the bridgeheads, concluded that Soviet forces appeared to be preparing for offensive operations, but probably not before spring, when ground conditions would favor armored movement. This assessment reflected methodological assumptions about how armies prepared for major operations, assumptions based on Wehrmacht practice, where divisions required weeks of rest and refitting between offensive actions. Soviet operational doctrine, refined through 3 years of continuous combat, had evolved different methods. Divisions rotated through bridgeheads at night, units moved into position under strict camouflage discipline, and the logistical build-up proceeded not through obvious supply dumps, but through distributed stockpiles positioned within artillery range of the front line. Field reports from German forward positions told a different story than headquarters assessments, though these reports rarely reached senior commanders in unfiltered form. On January 10th, a patrol from the 17th Infantry Division, operating near the Magnuszew bridgehead, recorded in its war diary that Soviet artillery positions had multiplied despite no observed movement across the frozen Vistula. The patrol leader noted that silence itself had become suspicious, writing that the absence of normal activity suggests preparation rather than inactivity, as if the enemy has imposed radio silence and movement restrictions preliminary to attack. Another report from the 20th Panzer Division, positioned opposite the Polwi bridgehead, documented the discovery of fresh track marks in snow leading towards Soviet positions, but no tracks returning, indicating one-way movement of vehicles and equipment into the bridgehead. A reconnaissance flight on January 11th photographed what appeared to be new earthworks throughout the Soviet positions, though the pilot noted these fortifications seemed oriented westward for attack rather than eastward for defense. These tactical-level observations accumulated in division headquarters, but rarely reached Army Group A staff officers, who synthesized intelligence from multiple sources into assessments that reflected institutional expectations rather than field reality. The Soviet buildup proceeded according to Maskirovka principles that treated deception as equal in importance to actual force concentration. The first Belarusian Front's operations order, issued December 15th and stamped secret, specified that units would maintain normal radio traffic patterns while moving into attack positions, that dummy positions would be constructed east of the Vistula to suggest reserves remained uncommitted, and that actual force concentrations would be concealed through night movement and strict light discipline. Tank armies moving into the bridgeheads crossed the Vistula on temporary bridges constructed just below the ice surface, invisible to German aerial reconnaissance and capable of supporting 60-ton IS-2 heavy tanks, despite appearing to be nothing more than ice formations. Artillery regiments occupied positions at night and spent daylight hours camouflaged under white sheeting that matched winter landscapes, with gun crews forbidden from creating paths between positions or lighting fires that might produce smoke visible to German observation posts. The deception extended to tactical details. Soviet units maintained their previous radio call signs and transmission schedules even after different units had replaced them in the line, creating the impression that the same divisions remained in position throughout December, while actual combat strength increased by 300%. Weather conditions inadvertently supported Soviet preparations by grounding German reconnaissance aircraft during critical periods and creating frozen ground conditions that allowed tanks to move cross-country without creating the muddy tracks that would have revealed force movements. The winter of 1944 to 1945 produced unusually consistent cold in Poland, with temperatures remaining below -15 degrees Celsius throughout late December and early January. Rivers froze solid enough to support vehicle traffic, eliminating the bridging bottlenecks that typically slowed Soviet logistics. The frozen ground eliminated the mud that had paralyzed operations during autumn and spring, allowing trucks to deliver supplies directly to forward positions without requiring improved roads. Snowfall provided natural camouflage while also muffling sound, reducing the acoustic signature of tank movements that might otherwise have alerted German positions. Soviet quartermasters calculated that each tank army required 1,200 tons of ammunition, 200 tons of fuel, and 150 tons of food daily once operations commenced. The frozen ground conditions allowed these supplies to be stockpiled within 10 kilometers of the front line, rather than at distant supply bases, reducing the logistics tail that typically limited offensive operations. Soviet soldiers in the bridgeheads experienced the buildup as an intensifying pressure, a gathering weight of men and machines compressed into spaces too small for the forces assembled there. Nikolai Ivanovich Maslov, a rifleman in the 3rd Shock Army's 79th Rifle Corps, wrote in his diary on January 10th that we stand shoulder to shoulder in trenches where previously 3 men occupied what now holds 10. We sleep in shifts because dugouts cannot contain whole squads, and still new units arrive each night. Tank commanders reported similar crowding, with vehicles positioned so closely that turret traverse became impossible without coordinating with neighboring crews. Artillery batteries occupied gun positions with clearances measured in meters rather than the tens of meters doctrine specified, accepting increased risk from counter-battery fire in exchange for achieving the gun densities required for breakthrough operations. The concentration created practical problems beyond mere crowding. Field kitchens struggled to feed troops without creating smoke that might alert German observers. Medical services expanded aid stations in anticipation of casualties, and commanders conducted briefings in shifts because headquarters bunkers could not accommodate all unit leaders simultaneously. This compressed energy, this tactical spring wound, tight through 3 weeks of preparation, awaited only the order to release. The question of when to attack had been decided in Moscow, though the decision reflected Western Allied requests as much as Soviet operational calculations. On January 6, 1945, Winston Churchill sent a message to Joseph Stalin requesting Soviet offensive action to relieve German pressure on Western forces struggling to contain the Ardennes offensive. Stalin, who had been planning to launch the Vistula Oder Offensive on January 20th to allow Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front additional preparation time, moved the attack date forward to January 12th. This decision compressed final preparations into 6 days, but achieved the strategic objective of forcing German forces to shift attention eastward while Western Allied forces stabilized their lines in Belgium. The acceleration placed strain on logistics networks, still moving ammunition forward, but Zhukov and Konev both reported readiness on January 11th. In the Magnuszew bridgehead, in the forests concealing the 8th Guards Army, among the tank parks where 2nd Guards Tank Army waited for the breakthrough that would unleash them westward, Soviet forces completed their preparations. The frozen front, seemingly quiet through December's cold weeks, had become the coiled spring that would release on January 12th and carry Red Army formations 450 kilometers westward in 23 days of offensive operations, unprecedented in the scope and speed of their achievement. January 11th, 1945, 2100 hours, 1st Belarusian Front Headquarters, Łódź, Poland. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov stood before a sand table 3 meters long and 2 meters wide, pointing to miniature formations representing the 8 armies under his command, while staff officers marked positions with flags and symbols according to his instructions. The table represented the 180-kilometer sector from Warsaw south to the boundary with Marshal Ivan Stepanovich Konev's First Ukrainian Front, with the Vistula River's westward curve visible in blue-painted channels, and the bridgeheads at Magnuszew and Poznań shown as elevated platforms extending from the western bank. Zhukov moved his pointer to the Magnuszew position and described the operation in 3 phases: breakthrough utilizing concentrated artillery and armor to penetrate German defenses to depths of 15 to 20 kilometers, exploitation by tank armies racing through the breach to achieve operational depths of 100 to 150 kilometers, and pursuit where mobile forces would maintain pressure on retreating enemy formations while combined arms armies reduced bypassed strongpoints. Each phase built upon the previous, each required precise timing between adjacent armies, and each demanded that commanders maintain momentum regardless of casualties or tactical setbacks. The briefing lasted 4 hours, covered contingencies from bridge failures to unexpected German reserves, and concluded with Zhukov's characteristic instruction that commanders would be held personally responsible for achieving objectives on schedule. Soviet deep battle theory, developed during the 1930s by Marshal Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky, and refined through years of combat experience, conceived offensive operations as integrated systems operating across multiple depths simultaneously. The theory rejected the linear thinking that had characterized First World War operations, where attacks achieved breakthrough but failed to exploit success before enemies established new defensive lines. Instead, deep battle doctrine specified that armies must organize forces in echelons, each with specific missions at different depths. First echelon forces would achieve tactical breakthrough. Second echelon exploitation forces would penetrate to operational depths before defenders could react, and pursuit forces would maintain contact with retreating enemies to prevent the establishment of new defensive positions. The Vistula Oder Offensive represented the most ambitious application of this theory attempted to date, with planning assuming that mobile forces could sustain advance rates of 30 to 40 kilometers per day across 400 kilometers of enemy territory. Success required not merely breaking through German lines, but destroying the coherence of German operational command, preventing the enemy from forming successive defensive positions, and maintaining offensive momentum until strategic objectives were achieved or logistics imposed unavoidable pauses. German defensive doctrine, by contrast, had devolved from elastic defense in depth to rigid holding of linear positions under Hitler's direct orders. Generaloberst Joseph Harper, commanding Army Group A, understood that defending the Vistula line with 417,000 troops across a 400-kilometer front produced an average density of approximately 1,000 men per kilometer, adequate for security operations, but insufficient for sustained resistance against concentrated assault. Doctrine specified defensive densities of 3,000 to 5,000 men per kilometer for positions expected to withstand major attacks, suggesting that Harper's force should defend a front 1/5 the length actually assigned. The 4th Panzer Army, holding the sector opposite Zhukov's main bridgeheads, could field only 200,000 troops, despite nominally controlling 12 divisions, and many of these formations existed at 30 to 40% of authorized strength. Harper possessed minimal mobile reserves. German air support had been withdrawn to defend the Reich itself, and ammunition allocations had been reduced to conservation levels that prohibited the suppressive fire missions essential for disrupting attack preparations. Most critically, Hitler's orders forbade voluntary withdrawals, regardless of tactical circumstances, eliminating the elastic defense that had allowed German forces to trade space for time throughout 1944. The contrast in command authority illustrated fundamental differences in how Soviet and German military systems functioned under pressure. Zhukov possessed discretion to modify operational plans based on developing situations, authority to commit reserves without requesting higher approval, and latitude to shift forces between sectors as opportunities emerged. His relationship with Stalin remained complex and occasionally contentious, but the dictator generally allowed front commanders to exercise tactical judgment once strategic objectives had been specified. Harpy, by comparison, operated under constraints that made independent decision-making dangerous and sometimes impossible. The 4th Panzer Army's war diary for early January records 14 separate instances where tactical commanders requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions, noting that all 14 requests were denied by Army Group A headquarters under standing orders from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. When local commanders attempted to prepare fallback positions without explicit authorization, they risked court-martial for defeatism. This paralysis of initiative meant that German forces could not react to Soviet preparations even when tactical intelligence indicated impending attack, because reacting required moving troops, and moving troops implied retreat, and retreat without authorization constituted defeatism punishable by execution. The personal rivalry between Zhukov and Konev, encouraged by Stalin's deliberate policy of playing commanders against each other, shaped the offensive's execution in ways that operational planning could not predict. The boundary between 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts ran roughly northeast to southwest from Warsaw toward Krakow, dividing responsibility for the western advance, but creating ambiguity about which front would reach Berlin first. Stalin had refused to specify which force would receive the honor of capturing the German capital, instead drawing the boundary line between the two fronts, but leaving it deliberately unclear where that boundary extended once Soviet forces advanced beyond the Oder River. This ambiguity created a built-in competition where both marshals understood that speed and aggressive action might position their forces for the final assault on Berlin, while caution or excessive attention to flanks might surrender the prize to their rival. Zhukov, the more politically connected commander, with a reputation for frontal assaults and heavy casualties in pursuit of objectives, planned the most direct route toward Berlin through Poznań. Konev, technically more sophisticated and conscious of his secondary position in Soviet military hierarchy, designed a more complex operation that would sweep through Silesia before turning north toward the Oder, potentially positioning 1st Ukrainian Front to approach Berlin from the south, while Zhukov approached from the east. German command arrangements reflected the deterioration of Wehrmacht, institutional competence under years of Hitlerian interference, and the attrition of experienced leadership through constant combat. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, chief of the Army General Staff, possessed neither the authority nor the political capital to overrule Hitler's operational decisions, despite recognizing that defensive dispositions along the Vistula invited disaster. Guderian's memorandum of January 2nd, circulated to Army Group commanders, argued that Soviet preparations indicated imminent offensive action and recommended withdrawing to the Oder River position immediately, trading Poland's relatively flat terrain for the natural defensive barrier of the Oder and reducing the frontage requiring defense from 400 kilometers to 150 kilometers. Hitler rejected this recommendation, insisting that every kilometer of territory surrendered represented a failure of will, and arguing that defensive positions should be held until they became tactically untenable. The result was a defensive system that could not trade space for time, that lacked depth to absorb penetrations, and that depended on static resistance by understrength units against an enemy that had perfected the art of breakthrough and exploitation. Harper understood these weaknesses but could only implement the defense Hitler's orders permitted, positioning his limited forces in linear arrangements, that doctrine condemned as obsolete and circumstances rendered suicidal. The technical means available to each side reflected industrial capacity and strategic priority in ways that predetermined operational outcomes more surely than tactical skill. Soviet artillery preparation for the offensive would employ 8,700 guns and mortars, achieving densities of 250 to 300 tubes per kilometer in breakthrough sectors, figures that exceeded any previous concentration in military history. German artillery strength across Army Group A's entire front totaled approximately 1,600 tubes, of which perhaps 60% remained operational after months of combat without adequate replacement of worn barrels or fire control equipment. Soviet tank armies could field formations with 400 to 500 tanks each, organized as complete combined arms forces with integral infantry, artillery, and engineer support. German panzer divisions defending the Vistula line averaged 19 operational tanks per division, with some formations possessing fewer than 10 serviceable armored vehicles. The Luftwaffe could generate perhaps 300 sorties per day across the entire Eastern Front, while Soviet aviation planned 5,000 sorties daily in support of the Vistula Oder Offensive alone. These numerical disparities, combined with qualitative factors like fuel availability, spare parts, and crew training, created conditions where German defenders would face attacks. They could neither repel through firepower, counterattack through mobile reserves, nor escape through authorized withdrawal. The strategic context shaped both sides' approaches to the coming battle in ways that extended beyond purely military considerations. Stalin needed rapid offensive success to strengthen Soviet bargaining position at the upcoming Yalta Conference, scheduled for early February, where post-war European arrangements would be discussed with Churchill and Roosevelt, demonstrating that Soviet forces could advance 450 kilometers in 3 weeks, would prove that the Red Army could end the European war independently, if necessary, strengthening Stalin's hand in negotiations over Poland's future borders and the occupation zones in Germany. Increasingly detached from military reality and committed to preventing Army Group collapse through sheer willpower, insisted that every defensive position must hold regardless of circumstances, that retreat represented political and ideological failure more than tactical adjustment, and that Germany's survival required defending every meter of occupied territory until some combination of wonder weapons, alliance fractures, or enemy exhaustion produced favorable settlement terms. These divergent strategic conceptions, Soviet offensive determination matched against German defensive rigidity, created conditions where operational competence became almost irrelevant. The architects of annihilation on both sides understood what would happen when the offensive began, though only the architects on the Soviet side possessed the means and authority to execute their designs, while their German counterparts could only implement half measures constrained by political interference and material shortages that made effective defense impossible, regardless of tactical skill or operational judgment. January 12, 1945, 0400 hours. Artillery positions 3 kilometers east of Magnuszew bridgehead. Senior Sergeant Ivan Dmitrovich Sokolov of the 11th Artillery Division pressed his hands against his ears as the first salvo of Katyusha rockets tore overhead. The multiple launch rails mounted on American Studebaker trucks, rippling fire in sequences that turned darkness into stuttering daylight and transformed silence into sustained thunder that registered as physical pressure rather than mere sound. The rocket barrage lasted 8 minutes. 320 BM-13 launchers firing 16 rockets each, 5,120 projectiles impacting across a 5-kilometer sector in a preparation designed not merely to destroy German positions, but to shatter the psychological coherence of defenders through sustained bombardment. As the last rockets impacted and smoke drifted across frozen fields, conventional artillery opened fire with mathematical precision, batteries firing according to schedules coordinated to the minute, shells landing in patterns calculated to suppress every known German position within 25 minutes of continuous fire. Sokolov, responsible for maintaining fire direction communications, watched as observers reported impact points and battery commanders adjusted aim points, the entire system functioning as an industrial process where targets became inputs and destruction became measured outputs, delivered on predetermined schedules with factory-like efficiency. The artillery preparation employed ammunition stockpiled through 3 months of logistical efforts that had overcome distances and infrastructure damage to create supply concentrations unprecedented in military operations. Each rifle division in the assault required 250 tons of artillery ammunition for the initial breakthrough phase, while tank armies needed an additional 150 tons for their integral artillery units and self-propelled gun regiments. The total ammunition expenditure for the first 3 days of offensive operations exceeded 2,500,000 rounds, ranging from 76mm divisional gun shells to 203mm howitzer projectiles, each type positioned at battery locations according to plans that specified exact quantities per position and per mission. Soviet logistics officers had calculated that sustaining this fire rate required 6,000 trucks operating continuously between ammunition dumps and firing positions, moving shells forward even as guns consumed them at rates approaching complete battery loads every 45 minutes during intensive phases. The mathematics of bombardment had been reduced to logistical calculations where success depended not on tactical inspiration, but on the industrial capacity to produce shells, the transportation assets to move them forward, and the organizational competence to distribute ammunition to thousands of battery positions across hundreds of kilometers of front. Soviet artillery doctrine differed from German practice in fundamental ways that reflected divergent military philosophies and industrial capabilities. German artillery traditionally emphasized precision fire controlled by forward observers, ammunition conservation through careful target selection, and technical excellence in achieving destruction with minimum expenditure. This approach worked when ammunition supplies remained adequate and when artillery positions enjoyed security from counter-battery fire, conditions that had ceased to exist along the Eastern Front by late 1944. Soviet doctrine embraced mass over precision, accepting that saturating target areas with shells achieved suppression more reliably than precise targeting achieved destruction, and recognizing that industrial capacity could produce ammunition faster than precision training could produce skilled forward observers. The contrast became visible in firing rates. German batteries conserved ammunition by firing 10 to 20 rounds per gun per day on average, while Soviet batteries expended 200 to 300 rounds per gun during attack preparations. Soviet commanders accepted that perhaps 30% of shells landed outside optimal impact zones, but calculated that the psychological effect of sustained bombardment combined with the absolute certainty of suppressing every position within the target area more than justified the expenditure. Field reports from surviving German positions documented the bombardment's effects in language that struggled to convey experiences beyond normal combat parameters. The war diary of the 17th Infantry Division's 4th Regiment, recovered after the war from Soviet archives, recorded that at 05:15 hours, bombardment of such intensity commenced that observation became impossible, communication with forward companies ceased, and personnel in covered positions experienced concussive effects despite overhead protection measuring 2 meters of timber and earth. Another account from the 304th Infantry Division described how the ground surface appeared to liquefy under sustained impact, trenches collapsed despite revetments, and the noise level exceeded human auditory tolerance, such that men bled from ears despite attempting to shelter in deepest available positions. German commanders attempting to coordinate defensive fire during the bombardment found telephone lines cut by near misses, radio communications jammed or drowned by ambient noise, and runners unable to traverse impact areas where shell craters overlapped and unexploded ordnance made movement suicidal. The bombardment achieved its primary objective not through destroying every German position, an impossible task given that defenders occupied prepared fortifications, but through isolating positions from mutual support, preventing coordinated defensive fire, and creating conditions where German infantry would face Soviet assault forces without the artillery support or command coordination, that doctrine specified as essential for successful defense. The armored component of Soviet offensive power represented industrial production on a scale that dwarfed German tank output despite 4 years of combat losses. Soviet factories produced 29,000 tanks during 1944 alone, a figure that exceeded total German tank production for the entire war through December 1944. This industrial capacity allowed Soviet forces to field multiple tank armies, each organized as independent operational formations, with 400 to 500 tanks, 3 mechanized corps with integral infantry and artillery, and logistical support sufficient for sustained operations independent of rifle armies. The 2nd Guards Tank Army, waiting in assembly areas behind the Magnuszew bridgehead, fielded 523 tanks, including 294 T-34 medium tanks, 138 IS-2 heavy tanks, and 91 self-propelled guns of various types. Each tank carried 35 to 40 rounds of main gun ammunition, 2,700 rounds of machine gun ammunition, and fuel sufficient for 250 kilometers of tactical movement, supplies that positioned the army for immediate exploitation once breakthrough forces opened corridors through German defenses. The concentration of armored power in relatively confined areas created traffic management challenges that Soviet planners had learned to address through detailed movement tables specifying which units would advance on which routes at which times, eliminating the congestion that had plagued earlier operations when multiple mechanized formations attempted to exploit single breakthrough sectors simultaneously. American Lend-Lease contributions provided capabilities that Soviet industry could not match, particularly in categories like trucks, radios, and specialized equipment. The United States had delivered 409,000 trucks to the Soviet Union by January 1945, vehicles that constituted 67% of Soviet truck inventory and allowed logistics to keep pace with advancing combat formations. These Studebaker, Dodge, and Ford trucks possessed greater reliability than Soviet-produced vehicles, averaged higher speeds on poor roads, and required less maintenance per kilometer traveled. Soviet tank armies advancing into Poland would rely almost entirely on American trucks for their supply columns, with Soviet-produced trucks relegated to rear area transportation, where breakdowns caused fewer operational problems. Radios represented another critical category, where American equipment exceeded Soviet production, particularly for vehicle-mounted sets that allowed commanders to coordinate movement while in motion. The combination of American mobility and communications equipment with Soviet weapons and numerical mass created hybrid forces that combined industrial strengths from different productive systems, though Soviet official histories typically minimized Lend-Lease contributions in favor of narratives emphasizing domestic production achievements. Aviation assets assigned to support the Vistula Oder Offensive included formations equipped with American aircraft and tactics, adapted from experience against German air defenses in thousands of previous missions. The 2nd Air Army, supporting Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front, could field 1,800 combat aircraft, including 600 Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes, 400 Yak fighters, and specialized reconnaissance and transport units. German Luftwaffe forces opposing these formations totaled perhaps 300 operational aircraft across the entire Eastern Front sector from Baltic to Carpathians, with chronic fuel shortages, limiting sortie rates, and pilot attrition having degraded average experience levels to the point where German fighter formations frequently refused to engage numerically superior Soviet fighters. The air superiority situation meant that Soviet ground forces could operate without significant interference from German aircraft, while Soviet aviation provided close support. That doctrine increasingly emphasized as critical for breakthrough operations. WW2 pilots had developed tactics for suppressing German strongpoints, flying low-level attacks with rockets, bombs and 37mm cannon fire against bunkers and gun positions, accepting losses to anti-aircraft fire in exchange for eliminating resistance that might slow ground advances. Soviet air doctrine had evolved from the defensive battles of 1941 through increasingly sophisticated coordination between air and ground forces, a learning curve purchased with thousands of aircraft and pilots, but resulting in aviation tactics that German defenses could no longer effectively counter. The complete Soviet logistics system supporting the offensive represented organizational achievement equal to the tactical preparations, a synthesis of industrial output, transportation management, and supply distribution that created the material foundation for operational success. Ammunition requirements alone consumed the output of dozens of factories operating continuously, shells moving from production lines to trains to truck convoys to battery positions in supply chains, spanning thousands of kilometers. Food supplies for 2,200,000 troops required 5,500 tons daily, calculated as 2 kilograms per soldier, delivered through field kitchens that moved forward with advancing units. Fuel consumption by tank armies, truck convoys, and aviation units totaled approximately 8,000 tons per day during intensive operations, petroleum products moving forward through pipeline sections laid across frozen ground and through tanker trucks operating continuously between depots and consumption points. Spare parts, engineering equipment, bridging materials, communications wire, and 1,000 other categories of military supply accumulated in forward areas through logistics planning that specified requirements months in advance and track distribution with accounting systems that recorded every ton delivered to every unit. This arsenal unleashed on January 12 represented not merely weapons and soldiers, but the entire industrial and organizational capacity of a state that had mobilized every resource for war, transformed its economy into a military supply system, and developed the administrative competence to transform production into combat power at the place and time where operational planning required its application. The thunder of artillery, opening fire at 0400 hours, announced not just the beginning of attack, but the culmination of industrial, logistical, and organizational processes that had created the material foundation for operations that would advance 450 kilometers westward in 23 days. January 11th, 1945, 2300 hours, forward positions of the 24th Panzer Division, 2 kilometers west of Magnuszew bridgehead. Oberkreiter Hans Wilhelm Kessler stamped his feet against cold that penetrated 3 layers of clothing and watched breath vapor drift toward stars, visible in the clear winter night, listening to sounds that carried across frozen ground from Soviet positions, invisible in darkness ahead. The sounds had changed over recent days, less random movement and more organized activity, engines running at intervals suggesting vehicles warming for imminent operation, metallic clanking that might indicate tank tracks being adjusted or artillery pieces being shifted into new positions. Kessler had fought across Russia since June 1941, survived the retreat from Moscow and the encirclement at Korsun-Cherkasy, learned to distinguish between normal frontline activity and the peculiar quiet that preceded major attacks. The quietness worried him more than noise would have. The absence of radio traffic from positions he knew contained Soviet forces, the lack of visible lights or fires when temperatures demanded heating, the sense that thousands of men were holding their breath simultaneously in preparation for some coordinated action. His company commander had briefed the platoon earlier that evening, explaining that intelligence reported possible Soviet offensive action within 72 hours, but that orders specified maintaining current positions regardless of developments, that no withdrawal authorization existed, and that defense would be conducted from existing trenches until relieved or overrun. The defensive positions occupied by German forces along the Vistula represented hasty preparations constructed during autumn's fighting, rather than the fortified lines that doctrine specified for sustained resistance against major attacks. The 24th Panzer Division defended a 12-kilometer sector with 5 infantry battalions, averaging 2,400 meters of front per battalion compared to the 1,500 meters that doctrine considered maximum for effective defense. Trenches varied from chest-deep positions with overhead cover to shallow scrapes, offering minimal protection from indirect fire, quality depending on how long units had occupied particular locations and whether local commanders had prioritized fortification over other demands. Anti-tank ditches had been excavated at intervals but often terminated short of full sector coverage due to frozen ground and equipment shortages. Minefields existed on paper, but actual mine density achieved perhaps 20% of authorized levels due to allocation priorities that reserved explosives for Western Front sectors. The division's war diary entry for January 10th noted that defensive preparations remain inadequate despite 3 months' occupation of current positions, shortages of engineering equipment and materials prevent construction of adequate fortifications, and troop strength permits only linear deployment without reserves for counterattack or position reinforcement. German combat strength along the Vistula reflected years of attrition that had reduced Wehrmacht effectiveness to levels that made defensive success unlikely regardless of terrain or fortification quality. The 4th Panzer Army, responsible for the sector opposite Zhukov's main bridgeheads, fielded 9 infantry divisions and 3 panzer divisions, with total strength of approximately 200,000 troops, averaging 15,000 men per division, compared to authorized establishments of 17,000 for infantry divisions and 14,000 for panzer divisions. Infantry divisions typically possessed 6 infantry battalions rather than 9, with battalions fielding 400 to 500 men rather than the 800 doctrine specified. Heavy weapons existed at fractions of authorized levels, many infantry companies lacking machine guns or mortars, and relying instead on small arms and panzer-fast anti-tank rockets. The Panzer Division's condition represented particular degradation, with the 24th Panzer Division fielding 19 operational tanks on January 11th, compared to its authorized strength of 130 tanks and assault guns. Maintenance backlogs meant that vehicles awaiting repair often exceeded operational vehicles, but spare parts shortages prevented repairs, and fuel allocations restricted training that might have maintained crew proficiency for the few operational vehicles available. Volkssturm formations represented Germany's final manpower reserves, elderly men and teenage boys mobilized in desperation and committed to frontline service with minimal training and inadequate equipment. The 341st Volksgrenadier Division, positioned south of the 24th Panzer Division, included 2 Volkssturm battalions totaling 1,200 men whose average age exceeded 50 years. These formations received rifles without adequate ammunition, were issued uniforms scavenged from depot stocks in multiple patterns and sizes, and underwent training periods measuring days rather than the months that converted civilians into competent soldiers. A report from 4th Panzer Army headquarters, dated January 8th, described Volkssturm effectiveness as suitable for static defensive positions if supported by regular formations and adequate heavy weapons, unsuitable for mobile operations or independent action, morale fragile, and likely to collapse under sustained pressure. The commitment of Volkssturm battalions to frontline sectors reflected not tactical judgment, but manpower desperation, Germany scraping the bottom of its demographic barrel to field formations that met minimum numerical requirements while lacking combat capability that numbers implied. Kessler had watched Volkssturm troops arriving in his sector during December, old men and boys, carrying obsolete rifles and wearing civilian coats with military insignia sewn on, and recognized that these formations represented symbolic rather than genuine combat strength. Anti-tank defense, critical for stopping Soviet armored exploitation, existed more in planning documents than field reality along most of the Vistula front. German tactical doctrine specified anti-tank gun densities of 6 to 8 guns per kilometer in sectors threatened by armor attack, densities achievable through positioning 75 mm Pak 40 guns at intervals that provided overlapping fields of fire. The 4th Panzer Army possessed approximately 150 Pak 40 guns serviceable across its entire front on January 10th, achieving actual densities of less than 1 gun per kilometer even in priority sectors. The shortfall forced reliance on Panzerfast handheld anti-tank rockets, weapons effective at ranges below 80 meters, but requiring infantry to allow tanks to close to point-blank distances before engaging. Panzerfast supplies varied by unit, some companies possessing 30 to 40 rockets, while others had fewer than 10, allocations depending on supply priorities that favored Western Front over Eastern sectors. The few operational German tanks available for counterattack lacked fuel for extended movement, commanders husbanding petroleum reserves for emergency employment and positioning tanks as static pillboxes rather than mobile reserves. A captured Soviet planning document, recovered after the war, noted that German anti-tank defenses along the Vistula had been assessed as minimal and unsupported by mobile reserves, permitting breakthrough and exploitation by tank armies without significant delay for suppression of anti-tank positions. Hitler's insistence on defending every position to the last man eliminated the elastic defense that had allowed German forces to trade space for time throughout 1944. Traditional German defensive doctrine emphasized defense in depth, positioning forces in multiple lines separated by sufficient distance that penetrating one line required renewed assault preparation before attacking subsequent positions. This approach allowed defenders to fall back under pressure, establish new positions on favorable terrain, and counterattack against overextended attackers. Hitler's orders, issued repeatedly throughout late 1944, forbade voluntary withdrawals regardless of tactical circumstances, designated numerous cities as fortresses that must hold regardless of operational encirclement, and threatened commanders with courts-martial for permitting retreats without explicit authorization from Führer headquarters. The result was defensive planning that positioned forces in linear arrangements without depth, that lacked prepared fallback positions because preparing them implied intention to withdraw, and that prevented local commanders from conducting the tactical retreats and counterattacks that doctrine specified as essential for successful defense. Harper understood these constraints crippled defensive effectiveness, but lacked authority to modify orders originating from Hitler directly. Army Group A, planning documents repeatedly noting that defensive arrangements reflected political rather than military requirements. The contrast between German defenders and Soviet attackers extended beyond numbers to encompass training, experience, and morale factors that determined combat effectiveness independent of equipment quality. German infantry defending the Vistula included veterans with years of combat experience, soldiers who understood tactics and terrain employment, men who had survived battles that killed their less capable comrades. This experience provided competence that raw numbers could not capture, explaining how undermanned German formations often achieved tactical successes against numerically superior Soviet units during defensive battles. But experience could not compensate for absent heavy weapons, inadequate fortifications, and numerical disadvantages exceeding 5-to-1 in breakthrough sectors. Soviet infantry, by contrast, combined combat experience accumulated through years of offensive operations with material superiority that allowed commanders to accept casualties that German forces could not sustain. Soviet rifle divisions attacked with 9 infantry battalions, supported by divisional artillery, regimental guns, and attached tank units, combined arms packages that overwhelmed German positions through coordinated application of firepower and manpower. Soviet tactical doctrine accepted that leading assault battalions might suffer 50% casualties achieving breakthrough, but calculated that follow-on battalions could exploit success before German reserves arrived, a operational logic that worked when attacker possessed sufficient forces to sustain attacks through multiple echelons. The psychological situation among German defenders reflected recognition that strategic circumstances permitted no favorable outcomes, that defensive success meant surviving until tomorrow to face renewed attacks without prospect of relief or reinforcement. Kessler's diary, portions of which survived the war in family archives, recorded his assessment on January 11th. "We hear them across the river, thousands of engines, the sound of an army so vast that imagination fails to encompass it. Our officers speak of holding positions and conducting orderly defense, but every man who has fought Russians knows what happens when their masses attack with artillery support and tank armies. We will fight because orders require it and because discipline holds, but no one believes we will stop what is coming." This recognition, widespread among frontline troops, if rarely expressed in official reports, created defensive psychology that combined professional competence with fatalistic acceptance of probable outcomes. German soldiers would fight skillfully and inflict disproportionate casualties on Soviet attackers, but would do so without expectation that their resistance would achieve more than temporary delays. The contrast with Soviet offensive spirit, confidence built through years of advancing westward and material superiority that permitted aggressive tactics, created psychological asymmetry as important as numerical imbalances in determining operational outcomes. In frozen trenches west of the Vistula bridgeheads, German defenders waited for the storm they knew would break with morning, understood they lacked means to prevent breakthrough, and prepared to implement orders requiring defense of positions that tactical judgment recognized as indefensible, political requirements having subordinated military logic to ideological imperatives that measured success not through operational achievement but through willingness to sacrifice forces in futile resistance. January 12, 1945, 0500 hours. German forward positions west of Magnuszew bridgehead. The first sensation registered not as sound but as pressure, atmospheric compression that preceded the arrival of Katyusha rocket salvos by microseconds. 320 launchers, rippling fire across a 5-kilometer sector in sequences that transformed darkness into flickering orange illumination and silence into sustained roar that obliterated all other sensory input. Oberstreiter Wilhelm Schneider of the 17th Infantry Division pressed himself against the earth floor of his dugout as the timber roof shook, dirt cascading from joints stressed beyond design limits by concussive waves that felt like physical blows striking the entire structure repeatedly. The rocket barrage lasted 8 minutes. 5,120 projectiles impacting across German positions in patterns designed not for precision destruction, but for area saturation. Each explosion creating fragmentation effects within 30-meter radius and blast over pressure sufficient to collapse exposed trenches or kill personnel through concussion alone. As rocket impacts ceased, conventional artillery opened fire with mathematical precision, 8,700 guns and mortars firing according to schedules coordinated to the minute, shells landing in waves that prevented German survivors from emerging from cover or attempting to man defensive positions. The bombardment continued for 25 minutes by Schneider's watch. 25 minutes, when survival depended on remaining motionless in the deepest available cover, while the world above became a continuous explosion that transformed familiar terrain into smoking lunar landscape, cratered beyond recognition. Soviet fire control officers, working from observation posts with clear views across the bridgehead, adjusted impact points based on observer reports, shifting fire from forward trenches to communication routes, to reserve positions in sequences calculated to isolate German defenders from reinforcement and prevent coordinated response to the assault that would follow bombardment. The mathematics of destruction had been refined through years of experience and countless previous attacks. Soviet artillery doctrine, having evolved systematic approaches to suppression that treated defensive positions as industrial targets requiring measured applications of explosives to achieve complete destruction or at minimum render them combat ineffective for periods sufficient to allow assault infantry to close and overwhelm survivors before defensive coherence could be restored. Soviet assault forces moved forward at 09:35 hours, reconnaissance battalions advancing through smoke and dust that obscured visibility to less than 50 meters, finding German positions obliterated or survivors too stunned to offer immediate resistance. The 8th Guards Army's leading divisions reported penetrations of 3 kilometers by 1000 hours, encountering scattered resistance from isolated German positions, but nothing resembling continuous defensive lines. German survivors described conditions that made organized defense impossible, even where positions remained physically intact. Telephone lines cut by bombardment preventing communication between units, radio equipment destroyed or operators killed, and command posts collapsed or abandoned after direct hits eliminated battalion and company headquarters. The 304th Infantry Division's War Diary recorded that, by 0800 hours, contact with forward companies had ceased entirely. Regimental headquarters received no reports from any battalion, and smoke prevented visual observation of German or enemy positions, situation unknown but presumed catastrophic based on intensity of bombardment and absence of defensive fire. Soviet doctrine specified that reconnaissance battalions would identify remaining resistance and bypass strongpoints, allowing main assault forces to exploit gaps rather than engage in time-consuming reductions of isolated positions. This approach worked when bombardment achieved its suppressive objectives, creating conditions where German defenses existed as disconnected fragments rather than mutually supporting networks, each position fighting independently without coordination or awareness of adjacent units' situations. By 1400 hours on January 12, Soviet forces had penetrated 17 kilometers deep into German positions west of Magnuszew, the 8th Guards Army advancing faster than even optimistic planning estimates had projected, resistance collapsing not through complete destruction of defending units, but through shattering of command relationships and communications that converted organized defense into isolated pockets of survivors fighting without coordination or understanding of larger tactical situations. The bombardment's effects extended beyond physical destruction to create psychological conditions that degraded defensive effectiveness even among troops occupying intact positions with functioning equipment. A post-war interview with Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, battalion commander in the 17th Infantry Division, described how the sustained nature of bombardment produced effects beyond casualties. Men who survived physically were rendered combat ineffective through shock, unable to respond to orders or operate weapons despite having sustained no physical injury, the noise level and concussive effects producing temporary incapacity that resembled severe shell shock, concentrated into minutes rather than developed over weeks of continuous combat. Soviet planners understood these psychological effects and incorporated them into bombardment planning, accepting that perhaps 30% of shells landed outside optimal impact zones, but calculating that sustained fire lasting 25 to 30 minutes would produce psychological disintegration even among experienced troops occupying prepared fortifications. The bombardment also disrupted German command decision-making at higher echelons, creating fog of war that prevented Army and Corps headquarters from understanding situations developing at division and regiment level. The 4th Panzer Army's headquarters log recorded 15 separate requests for situation reports between 0530 and 0900 hours, receiving responses from only 4 of 12 divisions in the Army's sector, with responding divisions reporting communications failures that prevented them from contacting their own subordinate regiments. This intelligence vacuum prevented German commanders from identifying where breakthrough had occurred, which units required immediate reinforcement, and where mobile reserves should be committed to contain penetrations before exploitation forces could enter the breach. Soviet operational tempo capitalized on this command paralysis by maintaining continuous pressure that prevented German forces from establishing new defensive positions, assault waves following at intervals calculated to reach each successive position before defenders could recover from bombardment, reorganize survivors, and establish functioning defensive fire. The situation on Konev's first Ukrainian front sector, where offensive operations commenced January 14th, after weather delayed initial attack date, demonstrated that Magnuszew results represented systematic Soviet capability rather than fortunate circumstances. The Sandomier's bridgehead bombardment employed even greater artillery density than Magnuszew, 300 guns per kilometer compared to 250 at the northern bridgehead, achieving suppression so complete that initial assault waves advanced 8 kilometers before encountering organized resistance. German 17th Army defending this sector reported to Army Group A headquarters at 1100 hours January 14th that multiple penetrations across entire corps front, communications disrupted, forward divisions, report situations varying from serious to catastrophic, no reserves available for immediate counterattack, and Soviet forces apparently include tank formations already exploiting breakthrough, although assault commenced only hours ago. The speed with which Soviet mobile groups entered breaches reflected pre-planned exploitation schemes where tank armies waited in assembly areas positioned to advance through specific corridors as soon as assault infantry secured penetration depths of 10 to 15 kilometers. The 2nd Guards Tank Army began moving through the Magnuszew breach at 1300 hours January 12th, only 7.5 hours after bombardment commenced. Columns of tanks advancing westward at speeds approaching 20 kilometers per hour on frozen ground that permitted cross-country movement without regard to road networks. This rapid transition from breakthrough to exploitation represented the operational culmination of deep battle theory, the synthesis of artillery suppression, infantry assault, and armored exploitation into continuous operations that prevented enemies from establishing successive defensive positions, maintained offensive momentum through multiple echelons, and achieved penetrations to operational depths before defenders could react through commitment of reserves or establishment of new defensive lines positioned beyond the breakthrough sector. Hitler's response to reports of Soviet breakthrough, received at Führerhauptquartier during afternoon hours January 12, ordered immediate counterattack by panzer reserves to restore the Vistula line, an order that could not be executed because the panzer reserves specified in the order existed only on organization charts, actual combat strength having been reduced through months of attrition to levels insufficient for operational counterattacks against Soviet forces that had already penetrated 20 kilometers deep and continued advancing westward at rates that would carry them beyond reach of any German forces capable of conducting mobile operations. January 14th, 1945, 0800 hours. Assembly area of 2nd Guards Tank Army, 6 kilometers west of Magnuszew bridgehead. Colonel General Semyon Ilyich Bogdanov stood in the turret of his command IS-2 heavy tank and watched columns extending to the horizon. 523 tanks and self-propelled guns, arranged in march formation along routes that had been frozen dirt tracks 48 hours earlier, and now carried the weight of Soviet armored exploitation racing toward objectives 150 kilometers westward. The transition from breakthrough to exploitation had consumed less than 30 hours. Assault infantry penetrating German defenses on January 12th, rifle armies widening the breach through January 13th, and tank armies receiving movement orders at 1800 hours January 13th to commence advance at first light. Bogdanov's operations order specified objectives in phases rather than linear distances. First phase reaching the Pilika River, 40 kilometers west. Second phase, securing crossings of the Oder River, 80 kilometers distant. Third phase, advancing to the Vistula River, 120 kilometers from start positions. Each phase incorporating contingencies for German resistance, but assuming that momentum rather than combat would govern advance rates. The armor rolled forward, not in tactical formations prepared for immediate combat, but in road march columns, optimized for speed, tanks traveling at 30 to 40 kilometers per hour on frozen ground, infantry mounted on tank decks, or riding in American-supplied trucks, artillery towed by tracked prime movers, maintaining pace with lead elements. Soviet doctrine specified that tank armies should bypass resistance rather than engage in reduction operations, maintaining speed while allowing following rifle armies to reduce any German formations attempting to establish blocking positions. This operational concept, refined through 3 years of offensive operations, represented fundamental departure from German blitzkrieg theory, which emphasized destruction of enemy forces through encirclement and annihilation. Soviet deep battle instead prioritizing penetration to operational depths that collapsed enemy defensive coherence through rapidity of advance, rather than through tactical destruction of defending units. The pace of advance exceeded even optimistic Soviet planning projections. Lead elements covering 40 kilometers on January 14th and 53 kilometers on January 15th, rates that approached the theoretical maximum for sustained armored movement and far exceeded advance speeds achieved during summer 1944 operations, when Mud and German resistance had limited daily progress to 10 to 15 kilometers. Major Ivan Petrovich Volkov, commanding a tank battalion in the 9th Guards Tank Corps, recorded in his after-action report that advance proceeded more as road march than combat operation, encountering German rear area units, completely surprised by appearance of Soviet armor so far west of front lines, passing through supply convoys and administrative installations, whose personnel fled without offering resistance, and reaching objectives assigned for Day 2 of operations before noon on Day 1. German rear area collapse reflected the breakthrough's depth and speed, 4th Panzer Army headquarters having lost contact with forward divisions and possessing no accurate information about Soviet penetration depths or directions of advance. German units positioned 10 to 20 kilometers behind the Vistula defensive line discovered Soviet tanks arriving in their positions before orders to withdraw or establish blocking positions could be issued. Rear area troops trained and equipped for administrative functions, finding themselves in direct combat against armor formations without anti-tank weapons or tactical preparation for defending against mechanized assault. The chaos extended to German command arrangements, division headquarters evacuating positions before Soviet advance elements arrived, but often moving to locations that Soviet exploitation forces reached within hours, creating situations where German commanders established new command posts, only to discover Soviet tanks approaching positions they had assumed were securely in rear areas. Soviet Mobile Group Organization as complete combined arms formations allowed tank armies to conduct sustained operations without depending on support from rifle armies following at slower pace. Each tank army included integral mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery regiments, engineer battalions, and logistics units sufficient for 3 to 5 days of independent operations, creating forces capable of exploiting breakthroughs to operational depths without pausing for resupply or reinforcement. The 9th Mechanized Corps, component of 2nd Guards Tank Army, fielded 3 mechanized brigades with mounted infantry, 1 tank brigade, artillery regiment, anti-aircraft battalion, engineer battalion, and service units totaling 11,200 troops with 185 tanks and 58 self-propelled guns, organized as self-sufficient formation, capable of independent combat. This organizational structure reflected lessons learned from 1941 and 1942, when Soviet armored formations achieved tactical breakthroughs, but then stalled for lack of infantry support, artillery, or logistics, allowing German forces to contain penetrations and restore defensive lines. By January 1945, Soviet tank armies functioned as operational-level formations, rather than enlarged tactical units, capable of conducting missions previously requiring coordination between multiple army types and achieving depths of advance that German forces could not counter through tactical responses alone. The advance consumed supplies at rates that tested even sophisticated Soviet logistics. Each tank army requiring 1,200 tons of ammunition, 200 tons of fuel, and 150 tons of food daily, supplies delivered by truck convoys that operated continuously between forward units and supply bases established at Vistula crossing sites. Fuel consumption represented particular challenge. T-34 medium tanks, averaging 180 liters per 100 kilometers traveled, meaning a 40-kilometer advance, consumed 72 liters per tank, or 37,000 liters for a full tank brigade. Petroleum products that had to be moved forward by tanker trucks traveling the same roads that combat units used for tactical movement. The strategic objective of the exploitation phase extended beyond territorial gain to destruction of German operational coherence, preventing 4th Panzer Army from establishing successive defensive lines and maintaining pressure that forced German forces into continuous retreat without opportunity to organize coordinated resistance. Soviet operational planning assumed that German forces would attempt to establish defensive positions on successive river lines, natural obstacles that provided terrain advantages for defenders and channeled attacker movement to bridge sites susceptible to defense. The speed of Soviet advance prevented implementation of this defensive strategy by reaching river crossings before German engineers could prepare demolitions or defending units could occupy positions. On January 15th, forward battalions of the 5th Guards Tank Army seized bridges over the Pilika River intact at Tomazow Mazowiecki, capturing crossings before German rear guards could execute demolition charges already in place. Similar tactical successes occurred at dozens of crossing sites, Soviet advance guards arriving as German engineer teams prepared demolitions, brief firefights resulting in Soviet capture of bridges intact or German destruction occurring too late to prevent Soviet engineers from establishing temporary crossings using bridging equipment moving forward with lead elements. The accumulation of tactical successes, bridges captured intact combined with rapid establishment of temporary crossings where demolition succeeded, maintained momentum that carried Soviet forces across successive river lines without operational pauses for deliberate assault crossings. German 4th Panzer Army headquarters attempted to organize defense of the Pilika River line on January 14th, issuing orders to divisions specifying defensive sectors and responsibilities for bridge demolition. But Soviet forces crossed the Pilika before defending units arrived at assigned positions, orders reaching divisions after the defensive line they specified had already been penetrated. This command tempo differential, Soviet operations proceeding faster than German command cycle could respond, created cascading failures where each German attempt to establish defensive positions failed because Soviet forces arrived before preparations completed, forcing German commanders into continuous retreat without achieving the organized withdrawals that doctrine specified as necessary for maintaining unit cohesion and preventing rout. By January 16th, 72 hours after exploitation commenced, Soviet tank armies had advanced 90 to 110 kilometers westward from Vistula bridgeheads, penetrations that positioned mobile forces within striking distance of major cities like Łódź and Sochdoka, threatened to encircle German forces still attempting to defend positions near the original front line, and created operational situation where German commanders faced choices between immediate retreat or probable encirclement, neither option offering prospects for establishing effective defense that might halt Soviet momentum before mobile forces reached the Oder River 150 kilometers beyond their current positions. January 17th, 1945, 1400 hours, Częstochowa, Poland, 120 kilometers west of Vistula bridgeheads. General Major Heinrich Hübner, commanding the ad hoc garrison of approximately 15,000 troops, designated as Fortress Częstochowa under Hitler's directive issued 3 days earlier, reviewed intelligence reports indicating Soviet forces had bypassed the city to north and south, continuing westward without pausing to reduce the urban position. The reports described Soviet tank columns passing within artillery range of city outskirts, but not deviating from westward routes, mobile forces maintaining advanced speeds that carried them beyond Częstochowa's vicinity within hours of initial sightings. Hübner understood that Hitler's fortress directive required defense of the city, regardless of operational encirclement, that no authorization existed for garrison withdrawal, even though tactical situation clearly indicated Soviet forces had isolated the position, and that defending Częstochowa served no military purpose beyond tying down garrison forces that might otherwise retreat westward to join formations attempting to establish defensive lines closer to German borders. The fortress concept reflected Hitler's conviction that defended cities would disrupt Soviet logistics and tie down Soviet forces required for reduction operations, assumptions that proved false when Soviet commanders simply bypassed fortresses and continued exploitation, leaving minimal containment forces while main bodies raced westward. German doctrine and professional military judgment indicated that forces encircled without relief prospects should attempt breakout while mobility remained possible. But Hitler's orders specified that fortress garrisons would hold positions until relieved or until explicit authorization for withdrawal arrived from Führerhauptquartier, orders that effectively condemned garrison forces to eventual destruction in positions lacking strategic value. Hübner drafted orders for garrison deployment throughout Częstochowa's urban area, positioned artillery to defend approaches even though Soviet forces showed no indication of attacking, and prepared reports for Army Group A headquarters describing garrison status and defensive preparations, while privately recognizing that these activities represented adherence to orders rather than operationally sound military decision-making. Soviet encirclement doctrine, refined through years of offensive operations, specified that mobile forces would bypass resistance and continue advancing while follow-on rifle armies reduced encircled positions, allocating minimum forces necessary for containment while maintaining operational momentum. The 1st Guards Tank Army, advancing west of Częstochowa on January 17th, detached one mechanized brigade to establish blocking positions around the city. Approximately 4,000 troops with 40 tanks tasked with preventing German garrison from breaking out or interfering with Soviet lines of communication. This economy of force approach allowed tank armies to maintain advance speeds exceeding 30 kilometers daily, while rifle armies following 2 to 3 days behind main exploitation forces conducted deliberate operations against bypassed German positions. The 69th Army, designated to reduce Częstochowa, would not arrive in the city's vicinity until January 20th, 3 days after encirclement, by which time the fortress would be isolated deep in Soviet rear areas with no prospect of German relief forces reaching the position. The Soviet approach prioritized operational objectives over tactical completeness, accepting that German garrisons would hold fortress cities for weeks or months, but calculating that these isolated positions posed no threat to advancing mobile forces and consumed German troops more effectively than if those forces had withdrawn to positions where they might contribute to coherent defense. The mathematics favored Soviet operations, 15,000 German troops in Częstochowa, requiring perhaps 2 Soviet divisions for eventual reduction, but potentially delaying multiple Soviet armies if those German forces had withdrawn to defensive positions on operationally significant terrain, rather than accepting encirclement in cities lacking strategic importance. Multiple fortress cities across Poland experienced similar encirclement as Soviet mobile forces exploited breakthrough, and German commanders implemented Hitler's directives requiring defense of urban centers designated for holding. Poznań, 220 kilometers northwest of Częstochowa, received fortress designation on January 20th, when Soviet forces approaching the city made clear that General-Lieutenant Ernst Matten's garrison of approximately 60,000 troops would be encircled within 48 hours. Torun on the Vistula River, Schneidermühl near the pre-war German-Polish border, and numerous smaller cities became fortresses through similar processes, German garrisons receiving orders to defend positions after Soviet exploitation forces had already bypassed their locations and continued racing westward. The cumulative effect tied down hundreds of thousands of German troops in static positions, while Soviet mobile forces advanced unimpeded toward the Oder River, achieving in 3 weeks penetrations that reached German pre-war territory and positioning Soviet forces for final offensive toward Berlin. German attempts to relieve fortress garrisons failed uniformly, mobile forces required for relief operations either not existing or being committed to attempts at establishing defensive lines that Soviet pressure prevented from solidifying. The 48th Panzer Corps attempted to relieve encircled forces at Radom on January 16th through 18th, attacking northward with approximately 30 operational tanks and 6,000 infantry, achieving initial penetration of 3 kilometers before Soviet counterattacks halted the relief effort and forced German forces to withdraw, having accomplished nothing beyond adding casualties to losses already unsustainable. Similar relief attempts at other fortress cities achieved similar results, German mobile forces inadequate for missions assigned, and Soviet containment forces sufficient to prevent breakouts, while maintaining encirclements that would eventually result in garrison destruction or surrender. The civilian populations trapped in fortress cities experienced the consequences of Hitler's defensive strategy through artillery bombardment, urban combat, and eventual Soviet occupation conducted after weeks of siege operations. Częstochowa contained approximately 130,000 Polish civilians on January 17th, population that had not been evacuated before encirclement and could not leave once Soviet forces established containment perimeter. Soviet artillery bombardment of German defensive positions inevitably impacted civilian areas, apartment buildings and houses occupied by German troops becoming targets indistinguishable from purely military installations. Civilian casualties accumulating as siege operations progressed through weeks of shelling and eventual street fighting when Soviet assault forces entered urban areas. German policy prohibited civilian evacuation from fortress cities, partly from practical inability to move populations through Soviet lines, but partly from calculation that civilian presence complicated Soviet operations by creating humanitarian considerations that might limit bombardment intensity or assault tactics. This cynical approach to civilian populations as defensive assets proved ineffective in limiting Soviet operational approaches, Red Army forces conducting siege and assault operations without significant modification for civilian presence. Accepting that fortress reduction would produce civilian casualties and treating this as unavoidable consequence of German defensive decisions. The pattern established at Częstochowa and other fortress cities would repeat at Breslau, Königsberg, and Berlin itself. Urban combat producing destruction measured in city blocks obliterated, and civilian casualties numbering thousands. Consequences flowing directly from Hitler's insistence on defending positions rather than conducting fighting withdrawals that might have spared urban populations from battlefield conditions. By January 23rd, 1 week after initial encirclement, Soviet rifle armies had begun systematic reduction of multiple fortress cities, while mobile forces operating 200 kilometers west prepared for assault crossings of the Oder River, the exploitation phase transitioning toward operational culmination, but having achieved penetrations that carried Soviet forces from Vistula to Oder, 450 kilometers, in timeframe measuring days rather than the weeks or months. Such advances had required in previous operations the speed and depth representing perfection of deep battle operational theory. At the moment, its success rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete and created conditions where German forces could neither prevent Soviet advance through tactical resistance nor escape destruction through operational maneuver. January 27th, 1945, 1500 hours, Auschwitz concentration camp complex. liberated 6 hours earlier by lead elements of 60th Army, 1st Ukrainian Front. Colonel Anatoly Sergeyevich Shapiro, assigned as military observer to document captured German installations, stood at the entrance to Crematorium 2 in Auschwitz-Birkenau and attempted to process evidence that contradicted his previous understanding of German occupation policies, despite 3 years witnessing Wehrmacht behavior in occupied Soviet territory. The gas chamber extended before him, concrete room disguised as shower facility with false shower heads installed in ceiling, ventilation ports through which Zyklon B crystals had been introduced, and doors sealed with rubber gaskets to prevent gas escape during killing operations. Soviet military photographers systematically recorded every aspect of the installation, establishing visual documentation that might counter anticipated skepticism about industrial-scale murder facilities, cameras capturing the architectural details that transformed ideology into mechanical process. The crematoria ovens stood in adjacent rooms, 5 triple muffle furnaces designed for continuous operation, engineering specifications, calculating throughput in bodies per hour, rather than in any metric suggesting human remains received individualized treatment. Shapiro's report to front headquarters, drafted over following 48 hours, struggled with language adequate to describe installations whose purpose and scale exceeded previous Soviet intelligence about German concentration camp system. His summary noting that the facility represents not improvised response to security concerns, but deliberately engineered system for mass killing, requiring planning, construction and operation that implies policy decisions at national level rather than local initiative by camp commanders. The discovery would reshape Soviet propaganda approaches to German occupation, providing evidence of systematic genocide that transcended military conflict and justified increasingly harsh treatment of German civilians as Soviet forces advanced into pre-war German territory. The camp's liberation revealed approximately 7,000 survivors, prisoners too ill or weak to participate in evacuation, marches that had departed westward during preceding week as Soviet forces approached. Medical personnel accompanying 60th Army encountered conditions beyond their experience treating combat casualties, starvation so severe that standard refeeding protocols proved inadequate, disease prevalence requiring immediate quarantine measures, and psychological trauma manifesting in behaviors that frontline troops found incomprehensible despite years of combat exposure. Captain Boris Mikhailovich Levin, Chief Medical Officer for the Liberating Division, recorded that initial treatment attempts produced deaths as frequently as recoveries. Survivors' physical condition so deteriorated that food consumption triggered organ failures, medical intervention requiring approaches outside normal practice for treating malnutrition. The camp infrastructure revealed systematic organization of murder and exploitation, buildings designated by function ranging from prisoner reception through forced labor deployment to killing facilities and body disposal. Each component integrated into comprehensive system that processed prisoners from arrival to death with industrial efficiency. Warehouses contained possessions confiscated from victims, sorted by category and prepared for shipment to Germany, material evidence that complemented survivor testimony in documenting camp operations. Soviet intelligence officers conducted immediate prisoner interviews, collecting accounts that described selection processes, forced labor conditions, medical experiments, and gas chamber operations, testimony that would later form foundation for war crimes prosecutions, but that initially served propaganda purposes in justifying Soviet occupation policies. The discovery of Auschwitz followed earlier liberation of Majdanek camp near Lublin in July 1944, previous Soviet exposure to concentration camp system, providing context that made Auschwitz evidence credible despite its unprecedented scale. Majdanek's liberation had revealed gas chambers and crematoria, documentation of approximately 360,000 deaths, and similar patterns of systematic killing disguised as prisoner management. The consistency between Majdanek and Auschwitz evidence eliminated possibilities that either installation represented isolated aberration, instead indicating that industrial murder facilities existed as components of broader system operating across German-occupied territories. Soviet press coverage of Auschwitz, appearing in Pravda and Red Star beginning January 30th, provided detailed descriptions of gas chambers and crematoria, published photographs of survivors and installations, and explicitly accused German government of implementing genocide against Jews, Poles, and Soviet prisoners. Western Allied reaction to Soviet reports demonstrated skepticism rooted in previous Soviet propaganda excesses, British and American intelligence assessing that Soviet accounts probably exaggerated German atrocities for propaganda advantage, despite photographic evidence and survivor testimony supporting Soviet descriptions. This credibility gap would persist until Western forces liberated camps in Germany proper during spring 1945, discovering similar facilities that validated Soviet accounts and confirmed systematic nature of German genocide policies. The psychological impact on Soviet troops who encountered concentration camp evidence manifested in increasingly harsh treatment of German civilians, as Red Army forces advanced into pre-war German territory during following weeks. Junior Lieutenant Vitaly Nikolaevich Korotkov recorded in his diary on February 2nd that having seen Auschwitz installations and spoken with survivors, no soldier maintains illusions about German character or deserves criticism for actions taken against German civilians. What we discovered justifies responses that previous military ethics would have condemned as excessive. This attitude, combining legitimate moral outrage with desire for revenge, created conditions where Soviet forces committed widespread crimes against German civilian populations during subsequent advances through Pomerania and into Germany proper. Soviet command responses to troop indiscipline varied from official condemnations combined with minimal enforcement to tacit acceptance that German civilian suffering represented just consequences for Wehrmacht behavior in Soviet territory and concentration camp operations throughout occupied Europe. The contrast between official Soviet policy, which specified that German civilians should not be harmed provided they did not resist Soviet authority, and actual Soviet troop behavior created situation where German civilians experienced occupation through lens of individual Soviet soldiers' attitudes rather than through consistent application of military government policies. The liberation of Auschwitz thus functioned as catalyst that transformed Soviet offensive operations from purely military campaign into crusade, where moral dimensions justified actions that conventional military ethics would have prohibited, creating conditions where advancing Soviet forces operated with decreasing restraint as they moved deeper into German territory and encountered civilian populations associated with regime that had implemented industrialized genocide. The gates of hell opened at Auschwitz on January 27th revealed not merely Nazi crimes, but also unleashed Soviet responses that would characterize final months of European war, liberation of concentration camps providing evidence that altered moral calculations governing military conduct, and established context for understanding subsequent Soviet behavior toward German populations who would experience conquest tinged with vengeance derived from discoveries that shocked even troops hardened by years of brutal combat on Eastern Front. January 19th, 1945, 0600 hours, headquarters of 1st Ukrainian Front, Konev's command post 40 kilometers southeast of Chenstokhova, Marshal Ivan Stepanovich Konev reviewed operations maps, showing his forces advancing on two divergent axes, main effort driving northwest toward the Oder River parallel to Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, while secondary effort swept southwest into Upper Silesia's industrial region. The bifurcated advance reflected strategic guidance from Stalin, who had specified during planning conferences that Silesian industrial facilities must be captured intact if possible, that Germany's remaining coal production and steel manufacturing capacity concentrated in the region represented post-war assets too valuable to destroy through combat operations, and that Konev personally bore responsibility for achieving this objective, while simultaneously maintaining pace with Zhukov's race toward Berlin. The mission created operational tensions between speed and preservation, between bypassing resistance to maintain momentum, and reducing German positions carefully to prevent demolitions that might damage industrial infrastructure. Konev's solution deployed the 3rd Guards Tank Army on the northern axis toward the Oder, while committing the 4th Tank Army and multiple rifle armies to the Silesian operation, accepting that this division of forces reduced strength available for either mission, but calculating that achieving both objectives provided greater strategic value than optimizing for single axis of advance. The Upper Silesian industrial region contained coal mines producing approximately 15% of Germany's total coal output, steel plants capable of manufacturing 2 million tons annually, chemical facilities including synthetic fuel production, and machine works that supplied Wehrmacht equipment, installations that Soviet post-war economic planning assumed would be transferred to Poland or dismantled for shipment to Soviet Union as war reparations. German defensive preparations in Silesia combined military resistance with industrial demolition plans developed by Albert Speer's ministry, creating dual challenges for Soviet forces attempting to capture facilities intact. Generaloberst Ferdinand Schörner, commanding Army Group Center responsible for Silesia's defense, had received contradictory orders requiring both maximum resistance to delay Soviet advance and preservation of industrial capacity for continued German war production. Hitler's directive of January 17th specified that industrial facilities should be defended but not destroyed unless immediate Soviet capture appeared inevitable. Guidance that left local commanders uncertain about when demolition authorization existed and what criteria determined inevitability of capture. Speer's demolition teams had wired major facilities with explosives during December and early January, preparing bridges, power stations, coal mines, and steel plants for destruction, but awaiting authorization before executing demolitions. The timing question became critical as Soviet forces approached industrial areas, German engineers requiring hours to complete demolition procedures, but Soviet mobile forces advancing at speeds that compressed decision timeframes to minutes, creating situations where facility commanders faced choices between early demolition that might prove unnecessary or delayed demolition that might fail to prevent Soviet capture of intact installations. Konev's intelligence staff estimated that capturing Silesian industry intact required reaching key facilities before January 25th, assessment based on German defensive positions, and retreat rates that suggested demolition teams would execute destruction orders once Soviet forces approached within artillery range of major installations. The advance into Silesia proceeded through converging attacks from northeast and east, multiple Soviet armies compressing German defensive positions into progressively smaller areas while racing to reach industrial centers before demolitions could be completed. The 5th Guards Army approached Katowice from the northeast on January 22nd, encountering intensified resistance as German forces attempted to delay Soviet forces outside the industrial zone's core facilities. The 21st Army advanced from the east toward Gliwice, meeting similar resistance but achieving penetrations that threatened to encircle German forces defending forward positions. The tactical pattern reflected Soviet learning from previous operations where industrial preservation competed with operational tempo. Assault forces, now including specialized engineer detachments trained in identifying and disarming demolition charges, battalions assigned to seize key facilities immediately upon entering industrial areas before German demolition teams could execute destruction procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Yakovlevich Kuzmin commanded one such engineer battalion attached to 5th Guards Army. His unit briefed on locations of major coal mines and steel plants in Katowice area, provided with intelligence about expected demolition methods, and assigned mission of securing facilities ahead of main assault forces. Kuzmin's after-action report described operations on January 26th, when his battalion, attached to Lead Rifle Regiment, entered Katowice coal mining complex and discovered German engineers preparing demolition of mine shafts. Brief firefight, resulting in Soviet capture of facility before explosives could be detonated. Similar outcomes occurring at multiple industrial sites as Soviet assault forces prioritized facility seizure over territorial gain or enemy destruction. The operational results achieved Konev's dual objectives imperfectly but sufficiently to satisfy Stavka's strategic requirements, Soviet forces capturing approximately 80% of Silesian industrial capacity intact or repairable, while maintaining advance rates that positioned First Ukrainian Front on the Oder River by month's end. German demolitions succeeded at selected facilities where Wehrmacht rearguards held positions long enough for engineer teams to complete destruction procedures, several major bridges demolished, some coal mines flooded, isolated steel plants sabotaged through removal of critical components rather than explosive destruction. The incomplete demolition reflected contradictory German policies that delayed authorization for facility destruction until circumstances made systematic demolition impossible. Hitler's insistence on defending territory conflicting with Speer's preparations for scorched earth withdrawal, resulting in improvised decision-making that achieved neither effective defense nor complete industrial denial. Soviet capture of operational coal mines and steel plants provided immediate economic benefits, facilities beginning limited production under Soviet management within weeks of capture, output contributing to Red Army logistics and Polish reconstruction, while demonstrating to Stalin that Konev had achieved assigned objectives despite operational complications created by preservation requirements. The advance through Silesia cost First Ukrainian Front approximately 42,000 casualties during January 19th through 27th period, losses comparable to those sustained by First Belarusian Front advancing through less industrialized terrain, but occurring in urban and industrial environments that favored defenders and complicated assault operations. The casualties reflected tension between conflicting objectives, forces accepting higher losses to prevent demolitions and capture facilities intact, sacrificing the bypass tactics that had produced rapid advances with lower casualties in open terrain during exploitation phase, immediately following breakthrough. By January 28, Soviet forces controlled the Silesian industrial region and had resumed northward advance toward the Oder, the secondary operation having consumed 9 days, and positioned forces for convergence with main effort approaching river from northeast. Konev's front having achieved both speed and preservation sufficiently to maintain Stalin's favor, while demonstrating that operational art could accommodate strategic requirements beyond pure military considerations, when commanders possessed tactical flexibility and forces adequate for sustaining simultaneous operations on divergent axes with different success criteria governing assessment of achievement. January 30th, 1945, 1100 hours, Forward Reconnaissance Battalion, 5th Shock Army, approaching Oder River near Kustrin. Senior Lieutenant Pavel Konstantinovich Dmitriev halted his lead company 2 kilometers from the river and surveyed the terrain through binoculars, frozen flatlands offering clear observation toward the dark line, marking the Oder's course and the higher ground of the western bank visible beyond. The reconnaissance battalion had advanced 47 kilometers in the previous 24 hours, exploiting the disintegration of German defensive coherence that characterized final stages of the race to the river, encountering scattered resistance from rear area units, but nothing resembling organized defensive lines. Dmitriev's orders specified securing river crossings intact if possible, reporting German defensive preparations on the western bank, and establishing bridgehead on the far shore if opportunities permitted. Missions that assumed German forces might not have established effective defenses given the speed of Soviet advance, and Wehrmacht's demonstrated inability to form successive defensive positions during the preceding 18 days of Soviet offensive operations. The approach to Kustrin revealed a city still occupied by German military administration, civilian refugees clogging roads leading westward, and evidence of hasty defensive preparations on both river banks, suggesting that German commanders had only recently recognized the immediacy of Soviet threat. Dmitriev ordered his companies forward at 1300 hours, advance elements reaching the Oder's eastern bank by 1400 hours, and discovering that Wehrmacht engineers had demolished the main highway bridge, but that a railroad bridge 1 kilometer south remained standing, explosive charges in place, but detonation apparently delayed by command, confusion or communications failures that had prevented timely execution of demolition orders. The strategic significance of reaching the Oder resided not in the river crossing itself, but in achieving operational objectives 3 weeks ahead of planning schedules that had projected First Belarusian Front would reach the river by mid-February, after consolidation and logistics build-up, following anticipated pause on the Oder River line. The actual advance covered 450 kilometers from Vistula bridgeheads to Oder River positions in 18 days for First Belarusian Front's lead elements. Average advance rate of 25 kilometers per day, sustained across nearly 3 weeks of continuous operations. First Ukrainian Front achieved similar results on divergent timelines, Konev's forces reaching the Oder near Breslau on February 1st, after brief diversion through Silesia, total advance of 480 kilometers in 20 days, averaging 24 kilometers daily. The unprecedented advance rates reflected German defensive collapse more than Soviet operational superiority in isolation, though Soviet ability to capitalize on German weakness demonstrated that deep battle theory worked when conditions permitted sustained offensive momentum. The contrast with previous major Soviet operations illustrated the transformation. Operation Bagration in summer 1944 achieved 250-kilometer penetration in 8 weeks, advance rates of approximately 4 kilometers daily, while Vistula Oder offensive achieved nearly double the distance in 1/3 the time. Pace reflecting accumulated Soviet experience, refined logistic systems, and German defensive deterioration that eliminated resistance patterns that had characterized earlier stages of the war. German defensive attempts to halt Soviet momentum at the Oder confronted the same challenges that had prevented successful defense at the Vistula: inadequate forces spread across excessive frontage without mobile reserves or air support necessary for conducting effective operations. Army Group Vistula, hastily formed on January 24th under command of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, inherited responsibility for defending the Oder line with formations that existed primarily on organizational charts rather than as combat-effective units. Designated as Army Group Vistula's Mobile Reserve, fielded approximately 20,000 troops with fewer than 100 operational tanks. strength inadequate for defending river line exceeding 150 kilometers, or conducting counterattacks to eliminate Soviet bridgeheads once established. Himmler's lack of military competence compounded organizational weaknesses, the SS chief possessing political authority, but no experience commanding field armies, issuing orders that reflected ideological preferences rather than tactical realities, and establishing headquarters procedures that prioritized loyalty demonstrations over operational efficiency. The appointment represented Hitler's distrust of Wehrmacht professionalism following July 20th assassination attempt, preference for political reliability over military competence, creating command arrangements that guaranteed failure regardless of force availability or defensive terrain advantages. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, observing Army Group Vistula's formation from his position as Chief of Army General Staff, recorded his assessment that entrusting defense of approaches to Berlin to Himmler represents abandonment of rational military policy in favor of political gesture. Appointment guarantees inadequate defense and probable Soviet success in establishing Oder bridgeheads that will serve as jump-off positions for final assault on capital. Soviet forces established multiple bridgeheads on the Oder's western bank during final days of January and first week of February, seizing opportunities created by German command, confusion, and inadequate defensive deployments. The Kustrin bridgehead, secured by 5th Shock Army on January 31st, after suppressing weak German resistance on the western bank, provided 1st Belarusian Front with position directly threatening Berlin from 60 kilometers distance. Additional bridgeheads at Steino and near Opeln gave 1st Ukrainian Front crossing sites south of Breslau, though Konev's forces faced stronger German resistance than Zhukov encountered and required several days of combat to expand positions beyond immediate riverbank areas. The bridgehead establishment demonstrated Soviet operational flexibility, commanders exploiting targets of opportunity rather than adhering rigidly to pre-planned operations, doctrine permitting tactical initiative when situations offered advantages that planning could not have anticipated. The decision to secure bridgeheads rather than pause at the Oder's eastern bank reflected assessment that German forces lacked capability to prevent crossings and that establishing positions on western bank now avoided requirement for deliberate assault crossings later, calculation that proved correct when German counterattacks against Soviet bridgeheads failed to eliminate any established positions despite repeated attacks throughout February. The bridgeheads also created operational dilemma for Soviet high command. Positions within striking distance of Berlin invited immediate continuation of offensive toward German capital, but logistics realities indicated that forces required resupply and reinforcement before conducting operations of that magnitude. Tension between operational opportunity and logistical necessity that would dominate Soviet planning throughout February and March. The strategic question confronting Stalin and Stavka by February 5th centered on whether to continue offensive immediately toward Berlin or pause for consolidation before launching final assault. Zhukov advocated immediate advance, arguing that German defenses remained shattered, that Third Reich lacked reserves to reinforce Berlin's garrison significantly, and that operational momentum should be exploited before German forces recovered coherence. Marshal Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky and logistics staff officers presented contradicting assessments, noting that tank armies operated at 30 to 50% fuel capacity, that ammunition stockpiles in forward areas would sustain only 3 to 5 days of intensive combat, and that follow-on rifle armies lagged 50 to 80 kilometers behind lead elements, creating gaps that exposed mobile forces to potential German counterattacks against extended flanks. The northern flank situation particularly concerned planners, Second Belarusian Front's delayed start, having left German forces in Pomerania, positioned to strike southward into First Belarusian Front's lines of communication, threat requiring either immediate offensive to clear Pomerania or defensive deployments to secure the flank before continuing toward Berlin. Stalin's decision, announced February 7th, ordered operational pause to bring logistics forward, clear German forces from Pomerania through Rokossovski's offensive, and prepare for final Berlin operation with proper support, rather than gambling on continuation of January's momentum. The decision reflected hard-learned lessons from previous operations where Soviet forces achieved breakthroughs but then stalled for lack of supplies, prudent choice that nonetheless surrendered operational tempo and granted German defenders 6 weeks to reinforce Berlin's defenses, weeks that would transform final battle from pursuit operation into costly urban assault that consumed Soviet forces at rates exceeding all previous operations' casualty densities. The pause that reached Oder representing transition from offensive that achieved unprecedented results through speed and exploitation toward culminating battle, where material superiority and willingness to accept casualties would determine outcomes more surely than operational art or tactical skill, could influence increasingly attritional combat that characterized final months of European war. February 3, 1945, 0900 hours. Stavka Conference Room, Kremlin, Moscow. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin studied the operations map, displaying red arrows extending from the Vistula River to the Oder, 450 kilometers of advance achieved in 23 days, and listened as Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov argued for immediate continuation toward Berlin, while logistics officers presented data indicating forward units operated at fractions of authorized supply levels. The debate had consumed 3 days of conferences, Zhukov emphasizing that German defenses remained shattered and that operational pause would grant Wehrmacht time to establish defensive positions around Berlin, while Lieutenant General Sergei Matveyevich Shtymenko, representing Stavka Operations Directorate, countered with supply statistics showing First Belarusian Front's tank armies possessed fuel sufficient for 80 kilometers of operations against Berlin's 140-kilometer distance from current positions. The ammunition situation appeared equally constraining. Forward dumps containing supplies adequate for 3 days of intensive combat, compared to the 2 weeks of sustained operations that capturing Berlin would require, based on experience reducing fortified German cities. Stalin's questions focused on logistics timelines, demanding specific dates when supply levels would permit offensive resumption, rather than engaging theoretical debates about operational opportunities versus material constraints. Shtymenko's response specified 15 days minimum to stockpile ammunition and fuel at forward positions, 3 weeks to bring rifle armies forward to consolidate gains and provide flank security, and acknowledgement that Pomeranian situation required resolution before Berlin operation could commence without unacceptable risk to northern flank. The Marshal's decision, delivered February 7th, after additional consultations, ordered operational pause for consolidation, directed Second Belarusian Front to launch immediate offensive clearing German forces from Pomerania, and scheduled Berlin operation for mid-April, after supply buildup and flank security had been achieved through Rokossovski's northern offensive. Soviet bridgehead positions on the Oder's western bank came under sustained German counterattack throughout February as Wehrmacht forces attempted to eliminate crossing sites before Soviet logistics could support offensive resumption. The Kustrin bridgehead absorbed particularly intense pressure. 11th SS Panzer Army launching attacks on February 7, February 12 and February 18, with forces totaling approximately 8 divisions, including newly formed units, scraped together from training establishments and rear area formations. The German attacks achieved local penetrations ranging from 2 to 5 kilometers, but failed to reach the Oder bridges or compress Bridgehead to dimensions that would render positions untenable for Soviet forces. 5th Shock Army, defending Kustrin, reported repelling attacks through concentrated artillery fire supplemented by air support. Casualties totaling 12,000 Soviet troops killed and wounded during February's defensive battles compared to estimated German losses exceeding 25,000, casualty exchange rates favoring defenders equipped with prepared positions and superior artillery support. The Bridgehead battles demonstrated that German forces retained capability for tactical counterattacks despite strategic situations' hopelessness. SS formations and reconstituted Wehrmacht divisions fighting with skill and determination that achieved local successes, though operational circumstances prevented exploitation of tactical gains. Soviet defensive doctrine, refined through years of German attacks during earlier war stages, proved adequate for maintaining bridgehead integrity against forces lacking air support, sustained artillery superiority, or numerical advantages necessary for achieving decisive results against prepared positions defended by troops expecting attacks and positioned to defeat them through firepower rather than maneuver. German reinforcement of Berlin defenses during the February-March pause transformed the operational situation from pursuit to deliberate assault, requiring preparation equivalent to major offensive operations. The city's garrison increased from approximately 50,000 troops on February 1st to nearly 300,000 by early April. Formations including regular Wehrmacht divisions withdrawn from Western Front, Volkssturm battalions mobilized from Berlin's population, and SS units transferred from other sectors. Defensive preparations converted the city into fortress through construction of anti-tank barriers, fortification of buildings, preparation of street barricades, and establishment of defensive sectors with assigned units and specified responsibilities. General der Artillerie Helmuth Weidling, appointed Berlin defense commander in late March, implemented defensive scheme that organized the city into concentric rings, outer defenses positioned at city boundaries, intermediate positions throughout urban areas, and final defensive ring around government district where Hitler's chancellery and bunker complex constituted last stand positions. The fortification work consumed 6 weeks of effort, employing thousands of workers, military engineers, and impressed civilian labor, achieving defensive density that Soviet intelligence assessed as comparable to Königsberg or other fortress cities that had required weeks of combat and massive casualties to reduce. The contrast between Berlin's defensive state in early February, when city possessed minimal prepared positions and garrison inadequate for defending perimeter, and situation in mid-April, demonstrated cost of Soviet pause. Operational caution, having traded tempo for security, but granting German defenders time that transformed final battle into attritional urban combat rather than exploitation operation that might have captured city through rapid assault before defenses solidified. The strategic calculus underlying Stalin's decision reflected multiple considerations beyond purely military factors. Political requirements for Yalta Conference, scheduled for February 4th through 11th, demanding that Soviet offensive operations pause to permit Stalin's personal participation in negotiations with Churchill and Roosevelt. The conference agenda included Poland's future borders, occupation zones in Germany, and Soviet participation in Pacific War against Japan. Discussions where Stalin's negotiating position benefited from Red Army's demonstrated capability to advance 450 kilometers in 3 weeks and establish positions within striking distance of Berlin. Continuing offensive operations during conference would have prevented Stalin's attendance or created situation where military developments influenced negotiations unpredictably, whereas operational pause allowed Stalin to control timing and present recent advances as evidence of Soviet military predominance without ongoing operations, creating facts that might complicate diplomatic positioning. The Pomeranian situation provided military justification for pause that political requirements demanded regardless. German forces in East Pomerania and West Prussia, numbering approximately 400,000 troops, positioned to threaten First Belarusian Front's northern flank and lines of communication. Clearing these forces required major offensive operation by Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front, operation that Stavka planning directed to commence February 10th and continue through March, eliminating German threat before Berlin assault commenced. The northern offensive would also secure Baltic coast, closing evacuation routes that allowed German forces and civilians to escape by sea, and ensuring complete isolation of remaining German positions in Courland and East Prussia. The convergence of political requirements, logistics realities, and operational necessities created a situation where pause became inevitable. Despite Zhukov's arguments for immediate continuation, decision reflecting Stalin's preference for certainty over risk and willingness to trade time for thorough preparation that would guarantee success, rather than gambling on exploitation that might achieve spectacular results, but carried risks that cautious approach eliminated through patient accumulation of overwhelming material superiority before committing to final decisive operation that would capture German capital and effectively end European war. February 10, 1945, 0700 hours, Soviet assault positions 500 meters from Poznan's medieval citadel. Major Yuri Alexandrovich Petrov, commanding assault battalion from 8th Guards Army's 91st Rifle Division, reviewed attack orders, specifying his unit would lead the day's assault against citadel walls that had withstood 3 days of artillery bombardment without significant structural damage. The fortress, constructed in 19th century and modernized during interwar period, featured walls 3 meters thick at base, surrounded by dry moat 8 meters deep, and incorporated underground galleries connecting defensive positions that permitted German garrison to move reinforcements without exposure to Soviet fire. General Major Ernst Matten's garrison of approximately 60,000 troops had been defending Poznan since January 25, when Soviet mobile forces bypassed the city during exploitation phase, leaving approximately 8 Soviet divisions to conduct siege operations, while main Soviet forces continued racing toward the Oder River. The siege had consumed 16 days thus far, Soviet forces systematically reducing outer defensive positions through combined artillery bombardment and infantry assault, clearing urban districts block by block, while German defenders retreated toward city center and concentrated forces in citadel complex and surrounding fortified zone. Petrov's battalion numbered 380 troops on February 10th, reduced from authorized strength of 650 through casualties sustained in previous assaults, equipped with flamethrowers and satchel charges for reducing fortified positions, and assigned mission of penetrating citadel's outer defenses to create breach that follow-on forces could exploit toward fortress interior. Soviet siege tactics employed methodical approaches, refined through experience reducing fortified German positions throughout advance from Stalingrad to Poland, operations developing doctrinal frameworks for urban assault that emphasized artillery preparation, infiltration of assault groups, and systematic clearing rather than rapid maneuver. The bombardment preceding each day's assault consumed thousands of rounds from artillery positioned at ranges, permitting direct fire against fortified buildings, heavy guns reducing structures through sustained impact, while multiple rocket launchers saturated defensive areas with fragmentation that suppressed German infantry, even when bombardment failed to destroy fortified positions physically. Soviet aviation contributed to siege operations through medium bomber attacks against citadel and surrounding districts. Illinois T-2 Sturmovik aircraft conducting low-level strikes with bombs and rockets, though effectiveness remained limited against underground positions and thick-walled structures. The combination of artillery and air bombardment achieved suppression sufficient to permit assault infantry to approach German positions, though actual reduction required close combat with flamethrowers, grenades, and demolition charges applied directly to fortifications, defending each block and building. The casualty rates in urban assault operations exceeded those in mobile operations by factors of 3 or 4, assault battalions typically sustaining 20 to 30% casualties per day of intensive combat, compared to 5 to 10% losses during exploitation phase, differential reflecting advantages. Fortified defensive positions provided even when defenders operated with numerical inferiority and without air or artillery support, matching Soviet capabilities. German defensive capabilities within Poznań demonstrated that Wehrmacht retained tactical competence despite strategic situations' hopelessness, garrison forces conducting coordinated defense that maximized terrain advantages and extracted disproportionate casualties from Soviet attackers. Matten's defensive scheme organized the city into sectors defended by designated units with clear boundaries and mutual support arrangements, established supply dumps positioned to sustain combat without relying on external resupply, and prepared fallback positions permitting tactical withdrawals without defensive collapse when Soviet pressure rendered forward positions untenable. The citadel garrison included engineer units that maintained defensive works, conducted repairs after bombardments, and operated demolitions that collapsed buildings, blocking Soviet advance routes, or eliminated positions after German forces withdrew to subsequent defensive lines. Though limited to approximately 40 tubes, compared to several hundred Soviet guns, operated from covered positions within citadel complex, and conducted observed fire against Soviet assembly areas, achieving effectiveness disproportionate to numerical strength through superior fire discipline and careful ammunition conservation. The garrison's weakness resided in air defense, virtually no anti-aircraft weapons available, and Soviet aircraft operating without meaningful interference, limitation that mattered less than might be expected, because brick and masonry construction provided protection adequate against bombs and rockets, unless strikes achieved direct hits on specific positions. The most significant German disadvantage stemmed from isolation, garrison receiving no reinforcement or resupply after encirclement and operating with fixed ammunition stocks that declined daily through combat consumption, situation that established timeline for inevitable capitulation once supplies reached inadequate levels for sustaining defense. The civilian population trapped within Poznań during siege operations numbered approximately 80,000 Polish inhabitants and 15,000 ethnic German residents who had not evacuated before Soviet encirclement. Civilian casualties accumulated through artillery bombardment that made no distinction between military and residential areas, through crossfire when defensive positions occupied apartment buildings and houses, and through deliberate German demolitions that collapsed structures to block Soviet advance routes without regard for civilian occupants. Soviet assault doctrine specified that civilians should evacuate combat areas when possible, but provided no mechanisms for facilitating evacuation or guaranteeing civilian safety during operations, practical result being that Polish civilians remained in cellars and basements throughout siege, emerging only when combat paused to search for food or water in damaged buildings. German garrison policy prohibited civilian evacuation partly from belief that civilian presence inhibited Soviet artillery employment, assessment that proved incorrect when Soviet forces conducted bombardments without apparent modification for civilian presence. The Polish underground resistance within Poznań maintained contact with Soviet forces and provided intelligence about German defensive positions, assistance that produced some operational benefits, though Soviet command remained suspicious of Polish political loyalties and limited information sharing accordingly. The final assault on Citadel commenced February 20th and required 3 days of intensive combat before German defenders, ammunition exhausted and casualties exceeding 50%, surrendered on February 23rd. The siege statistics documented costs that fortress strategy imposed on both sides. German garrison losses totaling 28,000 killed and 23,000 captured, compared to Soviet casualties approaching 35,000 killed and wounded. Poznań having consumed forces equivalent to multiple rifle divisions that could have supported operations elsewhere, while achieving nothing beyond delaying Soviet use of the city as logistics base and demonstrating futility of Hitler's fortress concept when applied to positions lacking strategic significance or prospects for relief by German mobile forces that no longer existed in strengths adequate for conducting operational-level counterattacks against Soviet forces that by February controlled Poland and established positions threatening Berlin from 60 kilometers distance. February 24, 1945, 0400 hours, 2nd Belarusian Front Headquarters, Marienburg, East Prussia. Marshal Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky received Stavka directive ordering immediate acceleration of Pomeranian offensive. Stalin's message specifying that German forces in East Pomerania threatened 1st Belarusian Front's northern flank, and that eliminating this threat took priority over other 2nd Belarusian Front missions, including reduction of remaining German positions in East Prussia. The offensive, originally scheduled for February 10th, had been delayed by logistics difficulties, ice conditions on Neru and Vistula rivers that complicated bridging operations, and German resistance stronger than intelligence assessments predicted. Rokossovsky's forces numbered approximately 1 million troops organized in 5 combined arms armies, 1 tank army, and supporting aviation. Strength adequate for assigned missions, but deployed across frontage extending from Baltic coast to positions south of Danzig, where boundary with 1st Belarusian Front created coordination requirements between adjacent Soviet fronts. The German forces defending Pomerania included 2nd Army, with approximately 20 divisions, many under strength but occupying prepared defensive positions that exploited terrain favoring defenders, combined with ad hoc formations assembled from training units, rear area personnel, and Volkssturm battalions that provided numerical mass, if not combat effectiveness, equivalent to regular Wehrmacht divisions. The operational objective required driving westward to Baltic coast near Köslin, cutting German evacuation routes, and isolating forces in Pomerania and Courland while simultaneously protecting Zhukov's northern flank from German counterattacks that had struck southward from Pomeranian positions during February's first weeks, with results that penetrated Soviet lines 10 to 15 kilometers before being contained through commitment of reserves. Zhukov preferred to conserve for Berlin operation. The offensive commenced February 24th, with 2nd Shock Army and 65th Army attacking westward from positions north of Warsaw toward Neustetten, achieving penetrations of 8 to 12 kilometers on first day, despite German resistance more determined than encountered during January's Vistula Oder operation. The contrast in German defensive effectiveness reflected several factors: shorter retreat distances, allowing Wehrmacht units to maintain better cohesion, fortified positions constructed during months of occupation, providing infrastructure that hasty Vistula defenses lacked, and psychological recognition among German troops that Pomerania's loss would expose pre-war German territory to Soviet occupation, creating motivation absent when defending Polish territory. Soviet assault tactics employed artillery preparation densities approaching those used during Vistula breakthrough, 200 guns per kilometer in breakthrough sectors. Bombardments lasting 30 to 45 minutes before assault infantry advanced behind rolling barrages designed to suppress German positions through continuous fire during infantry approach. The artillery expenditure rates consumed stockpiles accumulated over previous weeks. Second Belarusian Front firing approximately 400,000 rounds during first 3 days of operations. Tonnage requiring continuous supply convoy operations to maintain forward dumps at levels supporting offensive operations. German artillery responded more effectively than during January offensive. Batteries positioned in prepared positions conducting observed fire that inflicted casualties on Soviet assembly areas and disrupted attack preparations, though numerical inferiority in tubes and ammunition shortage, preventing German fire from achieving more than local successes against Soviet numerical superiority. The weather conditions during late February complicated operations for both sides, temperatures fluctuating around freezing point, creating alternating frozen and muddy ground conditions that affected mobility unpredictably. The thaw periods transformed roads into impassable mud that stalled supply convoys and slowed tank movement, while freezing episodes created ice layers that improved trafficability but made infantry assault hazardous when soldiers crossing open ground lost footing on frozen surfaces. Soviet tank forces adapted by shifting movement to night hours when temperatures reliably dropped below freezing, accepting reduced visibility in exchange for ground conditions that permitted cross-country movement without regard to road networks. German defenders exploited mud conditions by positioning anti-tank defenses at choke points where Soviet armor had to use roads, achieving tactical successes when individual tanks became disabled and blocked routes for following vehicles. The 3rd Guards Tank Corps, advancing toward Boldenburg during first week of March, reported losing 37 tanks to mechanical breakdown, mine strikes, and anti-tank fire during single days operations when thaw conditions restricted movement to narrow corridors that German forces defended with remaining Panzerfaust teams and artillery positioned to cover likely approach routes. The losses represented approximately 8% of Corps' tank strength in one day, casualty rate unsustainable for extended periods, but accepted as necessary cost for maintaining offensive momentum that strategic situation demanded, regardless of tactical complications imposed by weather and terrain. Soviet naval infantry operations on Pomeranian coast complemented ground offensive through amphibious landings designed to cut German evacuation routes and prevent Wehrmacht forces from escaping by sea, as had occurred when Soviet forces overran Courland and East Prussia during previous operations. The 1st Guards Tank Army reached Baltic coast near Koslin on March 4th. Penetration of 150 kilometers in 9 days, achieving operational objective of cutting Pomerania in half and isolating German forces north of the breakthrough corridor. German forces responded by attempting to establish defensive perimeter around Kolberg and other coastal cities, while simultaneously evacuating troops and equipment by sea, using Kriegsmarine vessels operating from ports not yet captured by Soviet forces. The naval evacuation, component of Operation Hannibal, that would eventually transport more than 2 million German military personnel and civilians from eastern territories to western Germany, succeeded in withdrawing substantial numbers of troops during March, despite Soviet naval and air interdiction efforts. Soviet Baltic Fleet submarines sank several transport vessels, most notoriously Wilhelm Gustloff, on January 30th, with loss exceeding 9,000 lives, but lacked strength to prevent majority of evacuation convoys from reaching western ports. The partial success of German evacuation efforts meant that Pomeranian offensive eliminated threat to First Belarusian Front's flank and captured territory, but failed to destroy German forces completely, many formations escaping to participate in Berlin's defense during April, despite Soviet operational success in territorial and objective terms. The casualty statistics for Pomeranian offensive reflected brutal nature of late-war combat. Second Belarusian Front losses totaling 52,000 killed and 130,000 wounded during February 24th through March 24th period, month of intensive combat, achieving objectives at costs approaching those of major set-piece battles earlier in war, despite strategic situation by March 1945, clearly favoring Soviet victory, and German defensive operations serving only to delay inevitable rather than contest outcomes that material imbalances and operational situations had already predetermined in Soviet favor. January 20th, 1945, 1400 hours. Road between Bromberg and Schneidemühl. East Brandenburg. Hildegard Schmidt, 41 years old, mother of 3 children aged 7 through 14, pushed a handcart, loaded with possessions along frozen road, clogged with refugees, fleeing westward ahead of Soviet advance, that refugees could not see, but whose presence defined every decision about movement, rest, and survival. The temperature registered -12 degrees Celsius, cold that penetrated multiple layers of clothing, and created conditions where exposure deaths occurred within hours for elderly refugees or young children inadequately dressed for winter travel. Schmidt's family had departed their farm near Poznań on January 18th, after rumors of Soviet breakthrough reached their village, joining refugee columns that by January 20th numbered hundreds of thousands moving along roads, inadequate for traffic volumes that exceeded peacetime capacity by factors of 10 or 20. The trek proceeded at walking pace dictated by slowest refugees, elderly unable to maintain faster speeds, and families with young children requiring frequent rest stops, convoy averaging perhaps 15 kilometers per day, despite urgency that circumstances imposed. German military authorities provided no assistance beyond allowing refugees to use roads simultaneously, with Wehrmacht units withdrawing westward, creating traffic conflicts, when military convoys demanded priority and forced refugee columns off roads into snow-filled ditches, where movement became impossible for heavily loaded handcarts. The refugees carried food adequate for several days, clothing and blankets against winter weather, and valuables small enough to transport on handcarts, or carry personally, abandoning furniture, farm equipment, and accumulated possessions of lifetimes, when space and weight constraints made transport impossible. The scale of refugee movement exceeded anything previously experienced in European history. 12 to 14 million German civilians, eventually fleeing or being expelled from eastern territories as Soviet forces advanced, and post-war border adjustments transferred formerly German lands to Poland and Soviet Union. The exodus from East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, and eastern Brandenburg proceeded under winter conditions that turned refugee crisis into humanitarian catastrophe. Exposure killing tens of thousands during January and February when temperatures remained below freezing for weeks continuously. Children and elderly proved most vulnerable, infant mortality approaching 50% for births during refugee trek due to exposure and malnutrition, while elderly refugees died from exhaustion, hypothermia, or simply giving up when physical demands exceeded remaining strength. The refugee columns attracted Soviet air attacks intermittently, when aircraft encountered convoys on roads behind German front lines, strafing runs, killing hundreds. Though Soviet aviation devoted minimal effort to targeting refugees compared to interdiction missions against military transport and logistics. The greater danger came from exposure and deprivation, refugees consuming food supplies within days of departure, and thereafter depending on charity from villages through which they passed or scavenging from abandoned farms, nutrition declining to starvation levels for many families within 2 weeks of beginning flight. German authorities established temporary camps in cities like Stettin and Danzig, where refugees could rest before continuing westward or boarding ships for evacuation to Western German ports. But camp conditions offered minimal shelter, and overcrowding created disease conditions that killed as surely as exposure, typhus and dysentery, spreading through refugee populations concentrated in confined spaces without adequate sanitation. Soviet treatment of refugees varied from indifference to brutality. Individual Soviet soldiers' behavior ranging across spectrum, from allowing refugees to pass unmolested through ignoring their presence, to outright violence against civilians encountered during advance. Articulated in orders from front commanders and reinforced through political officer guidance, specified that German civilians who did not resist Soviet forces should not be harmed, and that Red Army discipline would be maintained according to regulations prohibiting crimes against civilians. The actual implementation of this policy depended on factors including unit discipline, officer supervision, troop attitudes shaped by years of warfare, including exposure to German atrocities in Soviet territory and recent discovery of concentration camp evidence, and practical reality that dispersed small unit operations in fluid combat situations prevented effective oversight of individual soldier behavior. The result created chaotic conditions where some refugee groups passed through Soviet lines without incident, while others experienced robbery, assault, or worse, from Soviet soldiers operating without supervision or with tacit approval from commanders who viewed German civilian suffering as justified revenge for Wehrmacht behavior during occupation of Soviet territory. Western zones received approximately 8 million German refugees by May 1945, concentration creating humanitarian challenges for occupation authorities attempting to provide food and shelter for populations that overwhelmed receiving areas' capacity, while approximately 4 million remained in territories transferred to Polish administration, where they faced expulsion over subsequent months, as Polish government implemented policies transferring ethnic Germans westward to create ethnically homogeneous Polish state within new borders established by Allied agreements. The naval evacuation component of refugee crisis, Operation Hannibal, transported approximately 2 million German military personnel and civilians from eastern ports to western Germany between January and May 1945, representing largest naval evacuation in history and partial success story amid broader catastrophe. Kriegsmarine vessels ranging from passenger liners to cargo ships to destroyers participated, operating from Baltic ports including Pillau, Danzig, and Kolberg, until Soviet ground forces captured facilities, ships making multiple voyages transporting evacuees to Kiel, Flensburg, and other western ports outside Soviet operational reach. The evacuation proceeded under hazardous conditions, Soviet submarines and aircraft attacking transport vessels, with results including Wilhelm Gustloff, sinking January 30th, with 9,000 deaths, Steuben sinking February 10th, with 4,500 casualties, and Goya sinking April 16th, with 7,000 killed, disasters that collectively exceeded Titanic's casualties several times over, yet represented small fractions of total evacuation numbers. The ships operated overloaded by factors of 3 to 5 times designed passenger capacity, vessels authorized for 1,000 passengers carrying 4,000 refugees, in conditions lacking adequate food, water, or sanitation, voyages lasting 2 to 3 days, creating circumstances where deaths from overcrowding and disease supplemented losses from Soviet attacks. Despite these conditions, Operation Hannibal succeeded in evacuating majority of refugees who reached Baltic ports before Soviet capture, achievement representing German naval competence and determination that contrasted sharply with Wehrmacht's defensive failures on land, though success in evacuation could not compensate for strategic and humanitarian disaster that forced millions from their homes and created demographic reshaping of Central Europe, whose consequences persisted through remainder of 20th century and beyond, into contemporary period when successor states continued, addressing property claims and historical grievances originating in wartime population transfers and territorial adjustments that Vistula Oder Offensive initiated through creating military facts that Yalta and Potsdam conferences ratified as basis for post-war European order. March 25, 1945, 1800 hours, Kremlin Conference Hall, Moscow. Joseph Stalin stood before operations map, displaying Soviet positions along Oder River, and drew boundary line between 1st Belarusian Front and 1st Ukrainian Front using blue pencil, the line extending westward from current positions, but deliberately terminating 60 kilometers southeast of Berlin, rather than continuing to the German capital, calculated ambiguity, creating competition between Zhukov and Konev for honor of capturing city. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov presented 1st Belarusian Front's plan requiring 16 days from attack commencement to Berlin's capture, operational scheme employing direct assault from Kustrin bridgehead westward through Silo Heights, defensive ridge towards city's eastern approaches. Marshal Ivan Stepanovich Konev outlined 1st Ukrainian Front's more complex approach, breakthrough south of Berlin, followed by wheeling movement northward that would encircle city from south and potentially position his forces to enter Berlin before Zhukov's frontal assault achieved penetration. Stalin questioned both marshals about casualty estimates, logistics requirements, and timelines, displaying particular interest in Konev's southern approach that might provide alternative if Zhukov's frontal assault encountered difficulties. The dictator's approval of both plans, with deliberately unclear guidance about which front would actually capture Berlin, intensified existing rivalry between commanders, competition that Stalin encouraged as means of maximizing effort while maintaining personal control over final decision about which marshal would receive credit for war's culminating victory. The conference concluded with direction that offensive would commence April 16th, date providing 3 weeks for final preparations, including completion of logistics build-up, arrival of follow-on rifle armies, still clearing German positions in Pomerania and East Prussia, and concentration of artillery and aviation assets that would achieve densities exceeding those employed during January breakthrough. Soviet force concentration for Berlin operation exceeded Vistula Oder Offensive levels in all categories. Stavka, committing resources that reflected recognition, this assault represented culminating operation requiring overwhelming superiority to guarantee success, regardless of German defensive capabilities. 1st Belarusian Front fielded 7 combined arms armies, 2 tank armies, and 3 air armies totaling 1,300,000 troops, 3,100 tanks, and self-propelled guns, 16,400 artillery pieces and mortars, and 3,300 aircraft. 1st Ukrainian Front contributed 5 combined arms armies, 2 tank armies, and air army with forces numbering 1 million troops, 3,150 tanks, and 13,400 artillery pieces. The combined force of 2,500,000 troops represented largest concentration assembled for single operation during entire war. Numerical superiority reflecting Soviet determination that Berlin assault would succeed through material preponderance rather than depending on operational art or tactical skill. The artillery concentration achieved densities of 295 tubes per kilometer in breakthrough sectors, heavier than Vistula concentrations, and sufficient to deliver devastating preparatory bombardments that Soviet planning assumed would shatter German defenses through sheer weight of fire. Ammunition stockpiles exceeded 7 million rounds, positioned at forward dumps, quantity calculated to sustain 20 days of intensive combat without resupply from rear areas. Provisions that demonstrated Soviet logistics capabilities had evolved to a point where supply constraints no longer limited operational planning. German defensive preparations during February and March transformed Berlin's approaches into fortified zones, employing terrain advantages, field fortifications, and urban positions that created multiple defensive belts extending 60 kilometers east of the city. General Gotthard Heinrici, appointed commander of Army Group Vistula in late March, replacing Himmler, whose military incompetence had become undeniable even to Hitler, implemented defense in depth that contradicted Führer's preferences for linear defense, but offered only realistic possibility of delaying Soviet assault. The Silo Heights position, ridge rising 40 meters above Oder River Valley and extending north-south across First Belarusian Front's anticipated breakthrough sector, became principal defensive line, employing 3 fortified belts, separated by distances preventing Soviet forces from suppressing all positions simultaneously. German forces defending Oder Line numbered approximately 1 million troops on paper, though actual combat strength probably reached 700,000 effective soldiers when Volkssturm units and rear area personnel were excluded. Forces organized in Army Group Vistula, defending sector from Baltic to boundary with Army Group Center south of Berlin. The defensive deployment achieved densities of approximately 3,000 troops per kilometer in critical sectors, adequate for sustained resistance, though inferior to Soviet concentrations in breakthrough zones where attacker achieved 5-to-1 numerical superiority. German armor strength totaled approximately 1,500 tanks and assault guns, approximately half Soviet tank numbers, but positioned in prepared defensive locations where terrain advantages partially offset numerical inferiority. The Luftwaffe's contribution remained minimal. German air forces capable of generating perhaps 300 sorties daily across entire front compared to Soviet aviation's planned 5,000 sorties per day. Air superiority situation so completely favoring Soviets that German aircraft rarely contested Soviet air operations except through anti-aircraft artillery defending key positions. The tactical plan for assaulting Silo Heights reflected Zhukov's preference for frontal assaults, supported by overwhelming firepower, approach that had produced results throughout war, despite consistently generating higher casualties than flanking maneuvers or more subtle operational approaches. The attack would commence with 30-minute artillery preparation at 0300 hours, April 16th, bombardment employing 143 searchlights positioned to illuminate German positions, and supposedly blind defenders. Theatrical touch that Zhukov believed would produce psychological effects, supplementing artillery's physical destruction. Assault infantry would advance behind artillery barrage toward first German defensive line, penetrate positions through numerical superiority and firepower concentration, then press forward towards second and third defensive belts, without pausing for consolidation. Tank armies would enter breakthrough once assault infantry had penetrated 15 kilometers. Exploitation forces racing toward Berlin's outskirts, 45 kilometers west of Silo, with objective of entering city by April 20th. Hitler's 56th birthday, and date with symbolic significance, that Zhukov intended to exploit for propaganda purposes. The plan's simplicity reflected confidence that material superiority would prevail, regardless of German defensive skill, assumption based on January's Vistula order success, and belief that German forces had deteriorated further during intervening weeks. Soviet intelligence assessments predicted 3 to 4 days to break through Silo defenses and capture Berlin within 12 to 15 days of offensive commencement, estimates that would prove optimistic when German defensive preparations and terrain advantages produced resistance exceeding expectations, despite overwhelming Soviet material superiority. The final preparations during first 2 weeks of April included forward positioning of assault armies from reserve areas, movement of tank armies into assembly areas immediately behind breakthrough sectors, and concentration of aviation assets on forward airfields. Activities conducted under camouflage discipline intended to achieve tactical surprise, despite strategic circumstances, making Soviet offensive inevitable. Deception efforts reflecting doctrine specifying that surprise contributed to offensive success, even when enemy anticipated attack generally, specific timing and locations remaining uncertain until assault commenced. April 16, 1945, 0300 hours, Soviet artillery positions east of Silo Heights. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Pavlovich Sorokin commanded battery of 122 mm howitzers, positioned 4 kilometers from German front line, 12 tubes arranged in firing positions prepared during previous week through excavation, creating protected positions and ammunition storage permitting sustained fire missions. At precisely 0300 hours, 143 searchlights positioned along 40-kilometer front illuminated German defensive positions on Silo Heights Ridge. Beams, creating artificial daylight intended to blind German defenders and illuminate targets for Soviet artillery observers, though actual effect produced backlighting that silhouetted Soviet assault troops against illuminated sky, while German positions remained shadowed. Simultaneously with searchlight activation, 8,600 artillery pieces and mortars opened fire in bombardment, calculated to last 30 minutes and deliver 900 rounds per German defensive position in breakthrough sector. Preparation designed to obliterate trenches, destroy fortifications, and kill or disorient surviving defenders before assault infantry began advance. The barrage proceeded according to schedule, coordinated to minute level. Batteries firing at designated rates against assigned targets, while forward observers attempted to assess results through dust and smoke that obscured visibility more effectively than darkness. Searchlights supposedly eliminated, German positions largely survived bombardment intact, defenders having withdrawn from forward trenches to reverse slope positions before bombardment commenced, based on Heinrich's assessment that Soviet artillery preparation would precede assault by sufficient time to permit tactical withdrawal that preserved forces, while allowing preparatory fires to strike empty positions. Soviet assault infantry advanced at 0500 hours behind rolling artillery barrage, lead battalions discovering that German forward positions had been abandoned, and that main defensive line occupied positions on Ridge's western slope, invisible from Soviet observation posts and protected from direct fire by terrain masking. The 8th Guards Army's assault divisions penetrated 3 kilometers during first 2 hours, advance proceeding faster than expected through German security zone, but encountered intensifying resistance as forces approached actual defensive line where German artillery and mortars conducted observed fire against Soviet formations visible on open slopes ascending toward ridge crest. German defensive fire inflicted casualties that mounted rapidly as Soviet density increased in breakthrough sector, multiple divisions advancing on narrow frontage, creating target-rich environment for German gunners who had registered fire missions on likely approach routes during previous weeks. Major General Vasily Ivanovich Zhukov, commanding 8th Guards Army, committed second echelon divisions at 0900 hours, when initial assault showed signs of stalling, decision that increased forces in breakthrough sector, but also intensified crowding on limited road network, ascending slopes toward German positions. By midday April 16th, Soviet forces had advanced 8 kilometers against stiffening resistance, pace significantly slower than planning projected and casualties exceeding estimates by substantial margins. The 69th Army, attacking south of 8th Guards Army, achieved even less progress due to terrain favoring defenders and German concentration of reserves in sector, where multiple assault armies created obvious breakthrough priority that German commanders recognized and reinforced. Zhukov's decision to commit 1st Guards Tank Army and 2nd Guards Tank Army during afternoon April 16th, before infantry had achieved planned penetration depths, reflected impatience with progress rates and belief that armored weight would accelerate breakthrough through shock effect and firepower. The commitment violated doctrine specifying tank armies should enter breaches after infantry penetrated 15 to 20 kilometers. Entering earlier risked tank forces becoming entangled in ongoing infantry battles and exposed armor to anti-tank defenses that should have been suppressed before exploitation forces committed. The actual result confirmed doctrinal wisdom. Tank armies attempting to advance through sectors where infantry divisions still fought for defensive positions created massive traffic jams on roads ascending silo heights, tanks unable to deploy off-road due to steep slopes and soft ground, columns backing up for kilometers as lead vehicles engaged German positions, blocking routes forward. German anti-tank guns positioned on reverse slopes engaged Soviet armor at ranges below 1,000 meters, achieving high hit probabilities against tanks channeled onto predictable routes and unable to maneuver. The 3rd Shock Army sector witnessed spectacular traffic jam when tanks, trucks, and infantry all attempted to use single road through swampy area east of heights, congestion creating target for German artillery that inflicted casualties and destroyed vehicles, while effectively halting Soviet advance for 6 hours until engineers improvised bypass routes. The commitment of tank armies on April 16th achieved minimal tactical results beyond adding to casualty figures that by day's end totaled approximately 30,000 Soviet killed and wounded, losses exceeding entire first week of Vistula Oder Offensive and demonstrating that German defensive preparations and favorable terrain could extract terrible costs even from attackers possessing overwhelming numerical and material superiority. The battle continued through April 17th and 18th, with grinding attritional character that resembled First World War combat more than mobile operations, characterizing earlier stages of Eastern Front fighting. Soviet forces advancing through sustained pressure that gradually overwhelmed German positions through numerical superiority, despite defensive competence that inflicted disproportionate casualties. German defenders conducted tactical withdrawals during night hours, abandoning positions that had become untenable and establishing new defensive lines on successive ridges and urban positions approaching Berlin's outskirts. Each withdrawal preserving forces for continued resistance, while trading space for time in final desperate effort to delay inevitable. Soviet casualties mounted steadily, rifle divisions sustaining 40 to 60% losses in 3 days of intensive combat, figures approaching catastrophic levels, but accepted as necessary cost for achieving breakthrough that operational planning demanded, regardless of tactical prices. By April 19th, Soviet forces had penetrated Silo defensive system entirely and advanced to Berlin's eastern suburbs, achieving operational objective but having consumed 4 days and suffered casualties exceeding 100,000 killed, wounded, and missing, compared to planning estimates, suggesting breakthrough would cost 30,000 casualties and require 2 days. The disparity between expectations and results demonstrated that Soviet operational planning continued suffering from optimism that underestimated German defensive capabilities and overestimated impact of material superiority against competent defenders occupying favorable terrain, pattern that had characterized Soviet operations throughout war and that culminated at Silo with bloodiest frontal assault in history of Eastern Front, measured by casualties per kilometer of advance. Achievements purchased at prices that raised questions about operational competence, even as strategic situation guaranteed eventual victory through sheer weight of numbers, regardless of tactical costs that more skillful approaches might have reduced substantially. April 21st, 1945, 0800 hours. Artillery positions in Weissensee district, northeast Berlin. Colonel General Vasily Ivanovich Kuznetsov, commanding 3rd Shock Army, observed through binoculars as forward battalions fought house to house through residential districts, 4 kilometers from city center, progress measured in blocks rather than kilometers, as Wehrmacht and SS defenders contested every building in warfare that transformed urban terrain into vertical battlefield where rooms, floors, and cellars became tactical objectives. Soviet assault tactics evolved rapidly during initial days of Berlin street fighting. Early attempts to advance along streets, proving suicidal when German Panzerfaust teams firing from upper-story windows destroyed lead tanks, while machine gun positions in fortified buildings swept infantry attempting to follow armored vehicles. The revised approach employed artillery and heavy mortars to reduce buildings systematically before infantry entered structures, teams advancing through buildings by blasting through walls between houses rather than using streets, and engineers supporting assault groups with demolitions and flamethrowers to clear defensive positions room by room. The pace remained glacial by mobile warfare standards, rifle divisions averaging 200 to 400 meters daily advance against resistance that yielded ground only after defenders exhausted ammunition, sustained casualties exceeding 70%, or received withdrawal orders from higher headquarters, coordinating defensive shrinkage toward government district, where final stand would occur. Berlin's garrison numbered approximately 460,000 troops on April 21st, combination of Wehrmacht divisions, Volkssturm battalions, SS formations, and miscellaneous units, including Luftwaffe ground personnel and Hitler Youth formations, forces adequate for contesting every district but lacking mobility or firepower to counterattack effectively against Soviet penetrations. The tactical employment of armor in urban combat required innovations different from open terrain operations, tanks advancing with infantry support rather than infantry supporting tanks, armor providing direct fire support against fortified buildings, while riflemen protected tanks from Panzerfaust teams that remained primary threat in close urban terrain. Soviet tank losses mounted rapidly during Berlin fighting, daily casualties of 30 to 50 tanks per army becoming routine as German anti-tank teams exploited close ranges and abundant concealment to engage armor from positions invisible until after firing. The IS-2 heavy tanks proved particularly effective in urban assault through combination of heavy armor protecting against Panzerfaust strikes and 122mm main gun capable of reducing fortified buildings with direct fire, single round often collapsing walls, or creating breaches that assault infantry could exploit. German defenders adapted by targeting IS-2 tanks specifically, recognizing that destroying heavy tanks disrupted Soviet assault techniques more effectively than engaging more numerous medium tanks that could be replaced more easily. The technological advantages that German armor theoretically possessed mattered little in urban environment, where engagement ranges averaged 100 meters, and where ambush tactics negated maneuverability advantages. Panthers and Tigers achieving no better results than T-34 medium tanks, when both operated in confined spaces where first shot determined outcomes more than armor thickness or gun penetration. The convergence of multiple Soviet armies on Berlin's center created coordination challenges as units advancing from different directions encountered each other and required rapid deconfliction to prevent friendly fire incidents. First Belarusian front forces advancing from east met first Ukrainian front units approaching from south on April 25th, encirclement closing west of Berlin and trapping German forces still defending city's western districts. The meeting also created competitive dynamic as Zhukov's and Konev's forces raced for objectives including Reichstag building and Hitler's chancellery, competition producing unnecessary casualties as units pushed forward aggressively to claim credit for capturing symbolically significant locations. Stalin's telephone call to Zhukov on April 26 explicitly assigned Reichstag capture to First Belarusian Front, ending competition, but only after both fronts had committed forces toward objective, creating coordination problems and duplicated efforts. The final assault on Reichstag building commenced April 29th after artillery bombardment reduced surrounding structures and suppressed German defensive positions in adjacent buildings. Attack forces from 3rd Shock Army's 79th Rifle Corps fighting through government district building by building toward objective whose symbolic importance exceeded military significance. The Reichstag assault became Soviet propaganda focal point despite building's limited defensive value. Newsreel cameras filming assault for domestic distribution and commemorative purposes, though actual combat required 2 days of intensive fighting before final German defenders surrendered interior positions on May 2nd. The human cost of Berlin's capture exceeded combined casualties for entire Vistula Oder Offensive January through March period, Soviet forces suffering 362,000 casualties, including 81,000 killed during April 16th through May 2nd operations, losses representing approximately 15% of attacking forces and demonstrating urban combat's attritional character when defenders possessed adequate numbers and determination. German military casualties totaled approximately 150,000 killed during Berlin battle, figures excluding civilian deaths that probably exceeded 125,000 through combat action, starvation, and disease during siege conditions. The disparity between Soviet and German military losses appeared smaller than typical Eastern Front engagements, ratio approaching 3-to-1 rather than 5 or 6-to-1 common in mobile operations, differential reflecting urban terrain advantages and German defensive skill partially offsetting Soviet numerical superiority. Hitler's suicide on April 30th removed final authority preventing German surrender, General Helmuth Weidling negotiating capitulation on May 2nd, after recognizing continued resistance, served no purpose beyond accumulating casualties without affecting inevitable outcome. The surrender negotiations excluded SS formations that attempted continued resistance until Soviet forces systematically reduced remaining pockets through May 2nd and 3rd, final shooting ceasing May 4th, when last organized German units laid down weapons. The victory represented culmination not merely of Berlin operation, but of entire Vistula Oder Offensive that had begun January 12 with breakthrough from Vistula Bridgeheads, carried Soviet forces 450 kilometers westward in 3 weeks of mobile operations, unprecedented in speed and scale, paused at Oder for 8 weeks of preparation and flank securing operations, then concluded with month-long battle for Berlin that demonstrated urban combat's costs, even when attacker possessed overwhelming superiority in all categories of military power. Final triumph achieved through material preponderance and willingness to accept casualties, rather than through operational brilliance or tactical innovation that might have reduced prices paid for political imperative of capturing German capital before Western allies advanced from Elbe River positions where they had halted to await Soviet conquest of city that Allied agreements had designated as Soviet responsibility. Despite Anglo-American forces' capability to reach Berlin first, had Eisenhower chosen to prioritize political over military considerations. May 8, 1945, 2300 hours, Berlin, Karlshorst District, Soviet Military Administration Headquarters. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed unconditional surrender documents in ceremony that formalized Germany's defeat and concluded European component of Second World War. Culmination of Vistula Oder Offensive's strategic consequences that had created conditions making German capitulation inevitable, regardless of Hitler's suicide or specific command decisions during final weeks. The victory statistics documented campaign unprecedented in scope and speed. Soviet forces advancing 450 kilometers from Vistula to Oder in 23 days during exploitation phase, January 12 through February 4, achieving penetrations that carried Red Army from Poland's interior to position 60 kilometers from Berlin, before operational pause imposed by logistics and flank security requirements. The total casualties from January through May exceeded 1 million Soviet troops, killed, wounded and missing across all fronts participating in offensive operations. German losses approached 2 million, including approximately 400,000 killed and 1,500,000 captured, figures representing annihilation of Wehrmacht's Eastern Front combat strength and elimination of organized German resistance east of Elbe River. The territorial consequences transferred Poland westward through Soviet annexation of eastern Polish territories and compensatory German territorial cessions to Poland, demographic reshaping that displaced approximately 14 million Germans from eastern territories through combination of wartime flight and post-war expulsions, migrations that created humanitarian catastrophe, but also resolved territorial disputes through brutal simplicity of population transfer. Soviet occupation of eastern Germany commenced immediately upon military operations conclusion, Red Army forces establishing military government throughout zone allocated to Soviet control by Allied agreements negotiated at Yalta and Potsdam conferences. The occupation exhibited characteristics varying from organized military administration in major cities to anarchic violence in smaller towns, where supervision remained minimal and individual Soviet soldiers operated without effective command oversight. German civilian populations experienced occupation through spectrum ranging from correct military government procedures to widespread crimes including robbery, assault, and rape, perpetrated by Soviet troops whose behavior reflected combination of desire for revenge, command tolerance of indiscipline, and absence of effective military police enforcement. Official Soviet policy specified that German civilians who cooperated with occupation authorities would receive protection and that Red Army discipline would be maintained according to regulations, but implementation remained inconsistent across units and locations. The NKVD followed Red Army combat forces closely, establishing security apparatus that identified and arrested former Nazi Party members, Wehrmacht officers, and anyone suspected of potential resistance to Soviet control, detention and interrogation procedures that created parallel terror system alongside military government's administrative functions. The political objective extended beyond military occupation toward establishing communist governance in Soviet zone, process beginning during summer 1945 through installation of German communists returned from Soviet exile and creation of political structures that would evolve into German Democratic Republic. German prisoners of war, captured during Vistula Oder Offensive and Berlin Battle, numbered approximately 1,700,000 troops. Prisoners transported to camps throughout Soviet Union for detention lasting years in most cases, decades for some prisoners not repatriated until 1955. The prisoner experience varied by rank and perceived culpability. Ordinary soldiers typically receiving minimal rations and harsh labor assignments, but eventual repatriation, while officers and SS members faced more severe treatment, including extended interrogations, war crimes investigations, and in some cases, execution or extended imprisonment. Mortality among German prisoners exceeded 20% during first year of captivity, deaths resulting from malnutrition, disease, and labor conditions that failed to account for prisoners' physical condition, after months or years of combat and frequent weeks without adequate food before capture. Soviet justification for prisoner treatment emphasized German behavior toward Soviet prisoners during Operation Barbarossa, when Wehrmacht permitted millions of Red Army prisoners to die from starvation and exposure during 1941 and 1942. Cycle of brutality that characterized Eastern Front's character throughout conflict and continued through treatment of defeated populations after combat operations concluded. Polish perspectives on Vistula Oder Offensive's outcome embodied ambiguity between liberation from German occupation and imposition of new Soviet control, replacement of one totalitarian regime with another that would dominate Polish politics for 45 years. The Polish government in exile in London protested Soviet territorial annexations and installation of communist provisional government, protests ignored by Stalin, who possessed military facts that Western allies could challenge only through actions they were unwilling to contemplate during final weeks of war against Germany. Polish underground forces, including Home Army elements, had cooperated with Soviet advance in many areas, providing intelligence and conducting operations against German lines of communication, cooperation that failed to produce political benefits when Soviet authorities arrested Home Army leaders and suppressed Polish nationalist organizations viewed as threats to communist control. The population transfers westward, Poles displaced from eastern territories annexed by Soviet Union and resettled in formerly German lands, created demographic transformation that established new Polish state within boundaries determined by Allied agreements rather than historical precedent or ethnic distribution. The industrial assets captured in Silesia and transferred to Polish control provided economic foundation for reconstruction, though Soviet reparations demands simultaneously stripped substantial equipment from former German territories for shipment to Soviet Union. The complex outcome created Poland that was larger territorially than pre-war state, more ethnically homogeneous through population transfers, but politically subordinated to Soviet Union, through occupation and installation of communist government that would maintain control until 1989, when Cold War's end permitted reassertion of Polish independence within framework of democratic governance and market economics. The aftermath of Vistula Oder Offensive thus established political geography and power relationships that defined Central European order throughout Cold War period. Military operations during January through May 1945, creating facts that diplomatic conferences could only ratify rather than modify substantially. Victory achieved through operational art refined over years of brutal combat, combined with material superiority purchased through total industrial mobilization, establishing Soviet dominance across Eastern Europe that would persist until internal contradictions of communist system produced collapse during final decade of 20th century. September 12, 1946. Nuremberg International Military Tribunal proceedings. Soviet prosecutors presented evidence documenting Vistula Oder Offensive's revelations about concentration camp system. Auschwitz liberation testimony supplementing visual documentation that shocked international observers, despite Soviet witnesses' credibility challenges stemming from Western skepticism about communist propaganda. The military historical interpretation of offensive operations began even before war's conclusion. Soviet military publications celebrating operations as vindication of deep battle theory, while Western analysts during early Cold War years dismissed Soviet achievements as mere numerical superiority, overwhelming qualitatively superior but outnumbered German forces. Colonel General Sergei Matveyevich Demenko's official Soviet history, published in 1948, characterized Vistula Oder Offensive as greatest triumph of Soviet operational art, demonstrating superiority of scientific socialist approach to military affairs over capitalist fascist military incompetence, assessment that subordinated military analysis to ideological requirements, while containing elements of operational truth about Soviet planning competence and execution effectiveness. British and American military studies, completed during late 1940s, emphasized German defensive handicaps, including Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawals, fuel and ammunition shortages, and numerical inferiority, analyses that attributed Soviet success primarily to German weaknesses, rather than acknowledging Soviet operational capabilities that Western militaries found uncomfortable to credit, given emerging Cold War tensions and requirements to justify NATO defensive planning based on assumptions about Soviet military incompetence. The tactical controversies centered particularly on Silo Heights battle, where Zhukov's frontal assault approach generated casualties exceeding 100,000 in 4 days, achieving breakthrough that flanking maneuvers or more sophisticated operational approaches might have accomplished at substantially lower cost. German commanders after the war, particularly Heinz Guderian in his memoirs, argued that competent defense could have prevented breakthrough indefinitely if Hitler had permitted tactical withdrawals and conservation of forces, rather than insisting on static defense that consumed divisions defending untenable positions. Soviet military analyses acknowledged Silo casualties, but justified losses through operational necessity of achieving rapid breakthrough to maintain momentum toward Berlin, arguing that alternative approaches would have consumed more time and potentially allowed German forces to strengthen Berlin defenses further. The debate about alternative histories, whether immediate continuation from Oder in early February would have captured Berlin at lower cost or resulted in logistical collapse, and German counterattacks against overextended Soviet spearheads, remained unresolved through contradictory evidence supporting multiple interpretations. Zhukov himself in post-war writings defended Paul's decision, while simultaneously arguing he could have taken Berlin in February if Stalin had authorized continuation. Contradiction reflecting Marshall's desire to credit himself with operational vision while avoiding responsibility for decision that arguably extended war and increased ultimate casualties. The logistics assessment demonstrated Soviet organizational achievement equal to operational success, sustaining 2,200,000 troops across 450 kilometers of advance, requiring supply chain management unprecedented in military history and accomplishment. That Western military establishments studied intensively during Cold War planning for potential operations in European theater. The American Studebaker trucks, comprising majority of Soviet transport fleet, enabled logistics tempo that Soviet-produced vehicles could not have sustained. Lend-Lease contribution that Soviet official histories minimized for political reasons, but that operational records demonstrated as essential for achieving advance rates, characterizing offensive's exploitation phase. The ammunition expenditure exceeding 8 million rounds during breakthrough and Berlin operations demonstrated Soviet industrial capacity and willingness to prioritize military supply over civilian consumption. Total war mobilization that achieved material superiority, justifying operational approaches, emphasizing firepower over maneuver. Contemporary military analysis recognized that Soviet logistics methods, particularly forward supply dumps and distributed storage reducing vulnerability to interdiction, provided models for modern military operations, despite technological differences between 1945 and contemporary periods. The strategic impact extended beyond immediate military consequences toward establishing Cold War European order, Soviet control of territory from Elbe River eastward, creating political division that persisted 44 years until German reunification in 1989. The demographic consequences, including expulsion of 14 million Germans from eastern territories, represented largest forced population transfer in European history, creating humanitarian catastrophe, but also resolving territorial disputes through elimination of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries where German minorities had provided justification for Hitler's territorial demands during 1930s. The moral controversies surrounding Soviet conduct during offensive operations, particularly crimes against German civilian populations, generated debates about proportionality and justification that continued through post-Cold War period. Arguments balancing German atrocities during occupation of Soviet territory against Red Army behavior toward German civilians, creating complex moral calculus without clear resolution. The concentration camp discoveries, particularly Auschwitz liberation, provided evidence establishing Holocaust as historical fact despite persistent denial attempts by fringe elements. Soviet documentation supplementing Western evidence from camps liberated by American and British forces during spring 1945. The military lessons from Vistula Oder Offensive influenced NATO and Warsaw Pact operational planning throughout Cold War. Soviet demonstration of deep operations capabilities informing Western defensive preparations, while Soviet military continued refining operational approaches based on 1945 experiences. Doctrinal evolution that produced sophisticated operational art that Western militaries gradually recognized and incorporated into their own doctrine during final Cold War decades. When intellectual exchange partially replaced earlier dismissal of Soviet military competence, recognition culminating in contemporary assessment that Vistula Oder Offensive represented one of history's most successful operational level campaigns, despite tactical costs and strategic consequences that created European division lasting through remainder of 20th century. November 3, 1995. Berlin. Commemoration ceremony marking 50th anniversary of war's conclusion. German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Russian President Boris Yeltsin stood before memorial to Soviet soldiers who died capturing Berlin. Political symbolism demonstrating how 5 decades had transformed relationships between former enemies, even as historical memory of Vistula Oder Offensive remained contested between narratives, emphasizing liberation versus occupation, military achievement versus humanitarian cost. Veterans of offensive operations, Soviet survivors numbering fewer than 50,000 by 1995, from original force exceeding 2 million, gathered at reunions throughout former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, sharing memories that emphasized camaraderie and sacrifice, while generally avoiding discussion of controversial aspects, including crimes against German civilians. German veterans, fewer still given Wehrmacht's higher casualty rates and age demographics, maintained separate commemorations that honored defensive fighting without glorifying Nazi regime. Complex navigation between remembering military experience and rejecting political cause for which Wehrmacht had fought. The Polish perspective incorporated both recognition of liberation from German occupation and acknowledgement that Soviet victory brought new subjugation. Ambiguity reflected in ceremonies that honored Red Army's role in defeating Nazism, while acknowledging that true Polish independence required additional 44 years before emerging from communist control. The military legacy influenced operational thinking across multiple generations of commanders. Soviet deep battle theory validated through Vistula Order success, becoming foundation for Warsaw Pact operational doctrine throughout Cold War, and continuing to influence Russian military thinking into 21st century. American and NATO military establishments studied offensive extensively, extracting lessons about operational depth, logistics organization, and combined arms integration that informed Western defensive planning against potential Soviet attack and eventually contributed to air-land battle doctrine developed during 1980s. The artillery employment methods, achieving densities approaching 300 tubes per kilometer through massed fires, established benchmarks that modern militaries struggled to match, given cost constraints and precision weapons displacement of mass fires in contemporary doctrine. Tank operations demonstrated importance of momentum in exploitation operations, while Silo Heights battle illustrated costs of frontal assaults against prepared defenses, contrasting lessons that informed debates about maneuver warfare versus attrition throughout late 20th century. The logistics achievement, sustaining multi-million troop forces across continental distances, provided case study in supply chain management, applicable beyond military contexts into commercial logistics and industrial distribution systems. The political legacy established post-war European order through military facts that diplomatic processes could only ratify rather than substantially modify. Yalta and Potsdam conferences, formalizing arrangements based on territorial control established through offensive operations. The Iron Curtain, dividing Europe for 44 years, reflected Soviet military dominance east of Elbe, combined with Western Allied unwillingness to contest Soviet control through military action, acceptance that created circumstances permitting communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe under Soviet protection. German division into occupation zones evolved into separate German states, Federal Republic in Western zones, and German Democratic Republic in Soviet zone. Political division lasting until 1990, when reunification became possible through Soviet Union's collapse and end of Cold War confrontation. Polish borders established through Vistula Order offensive's territorial consequences remained unchanged through German reunification. Former German territories transferred to Poland in 1945, remaining Polish despite changed political circumstances. Demographic fact of population transfer having created irreversible outcome. Despite historical German claims to Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia, the refugee crisis legacy persisted through property claims and compensation disputes, extending into 21st century legal and moral questions about wartime population transfers, remaining unresolved despite decades of diplomatic negotiations and European integration efforts. The human cost measurement defied precise quantification, given incomplete records and definitional disputes about what casualties should be attributed to offensive operations versus broader war context. Estimates suggesting 3 million total military and civilian casualties, including Soviet, German, and Polish deaths from January through May 1945 across operational area. The concentration camp discovery's impact extended beyond immediate liberation to establish historical record documenting Holocaust through evidence that Soviet, British, and American forces collected at dozens of sites, documentation forming evidentiary basis for Nuremberg trials and subsequent war crimes prosecutions. The moral complexity surrounding Soviet conduct during offensive operations, liberation of concentration camps, coexisting with widespread crimes against German civilians, created historical narrative that resists simplification into triumph or tragedy categories, but instead demands recognition that military success and humanitarian catastrophe occurred simultaneously as components of single extended operation. The technological lessons remained limited given nuclear weapons transformation of strategic warfare within years of 1945, conventional operations on Vistula Oder Offensive scale becoming obsolete for conflict between major powers possessing nuclear arsenals, relevance, instead transferring to limited wars and regional conflicts where conventional operations remained primary military method. The operational art legacy endured through military education systems worldwide studying offensive as exemplar of theater-level operations, staff colleges from Fort Leavenworth to Frunze Academy to British Defence Academy, analysing planning, execution, and adaptation that carried Soviet forces from Vistula to Berlin, demonstrating operational competence that Western militaries gradually recognized, despite Cold War political imperatives initially demanding dismissal of Soviet military achievements. The final assessment, emerging from decades of historical research and debate, acknowledged Vistula Oder Offensive as one of warfare's most successful operational campaigns, measured by objectives achieved and speed of advance, while simultaneously recognizing that success came at human costs extending beyond military casualties to encompass humanitarian catastrophe affecting millions of civilians, victory that demonstrated industrial age warfare's terrible efficiency, while also marking transition toward nuclear age, when such operations scale would become impossible between major powers possessing weapons capable of destroying armies, cities, and potentially civilizations, making Vistula Oder Offensive simultaneously culmination of conventional warfare's evolution and demonstration of its obsolescence. Last campaign where massed armies could fight across continental distances without nuclear weapons employment, bridge between warfare's past and future standing as monument to operational art's possibilities and warning about total war's costs, regardless of political cause or historical justification.